Hello and welcome back, guys. We're now starting a new story, The Heartbeat Between Us, by Muttermuttermutter. You can find author's profile link in the description. Let's begin. The dream didn't come every night, but whenever it did, it left Izuku staring at his ceiling long after the alarm had gone off, feeling like something was missing. Even at 24, after years of med school, residency, and surgical training that made most people lose their sense of wonder, he still ached to know what it felt like to be a hero. In the dream, he was a hero, standing in sunlight that made his hair stick to his forehead, breathing hard as if he had just run into danger. Sometimes he woke up with the phantom taste of dust in his mouth or the burn of a sprint in his legs, as if his body believed it had happened. No matter what, he couldn't shake the yearning from his mind. He knew it would never become reality. He had long accepted that he was quirkless. Yet, if the universe ever offered him a chance to become a hero, he would take it without hesitation. Since the moment he was born, he had wanted to be a hero, and that longing still left an ache in his heart. Whenever he had the dream, it felt like glimpsing the life he was meant to live. In the dream, he wore a green hero suit designed by his mother, stitched with love. His quirk was never the same twice, perhaps because his lack of one in real life had led him to imagine every possible power. Sometimes he could float, sometimes he had super strength, and other times he could sense danger before it happened. Each quirk felt like it had been his all along. But a dream was just a dream. He was content with his life as a doctor, one of the youngest surgeons in Japan. He got to save lives, even if it wasn't in the way he had once imagined. Still, his mind often drifted back to the dream of being a hero. He was content with his life, his apartment, and his friends, but he couldn't help but wonder what it must feel like to battle villains and come out victorious. He saw heroes in flashes on his way to the hospital or heading home after a shift. He was still a fanboy. At his age, he couldn't help but slow down to watch if a hero zipped past in a flash of color. His old notes filled with sketches and breakdowns of quirks had been replaced with diagrams of surgical techniques and protocols. Different dreams, but the same obsessive passion. His life wasn't glamorous unless collapsing into bed after a long shift was considered glamorous. His apartment was small but neat, as he was rarely home long enough to make a mess. His fridge was stocked with takeout containers and sports drinks, a testament to his busy lifestyle. His social life was fine. He met up with friends whenever their schedules aligned, usually over food that came in paper boxes. Hitoshi dropped by occasionally, mostly to check on him and see if he had any snacks. Mina once joked about climbing up his fire escape if he didn't answer his phone. Some days felt like everything he had ever wanted, other days were exhausting. On the worst days, he tried to remember why he chose this path to save people in a different way. Most mornings started with him running late, having hit snooze too many times. His neighbors probably thought he had a secret nightlife, as they only saw him in one of two states, rushing out the door or dragging himself home like a zombie. The hospital cafeteria staff knew his coffee order by heart, which would have been sweet if it wasn't a double espresso with 3 sugars. Mina joked he was 2 missed meals away from developing a quirk called cardiac arrest. He laughed it off, even as he ate a protein bar in the supply closet at 3 a.m. While some coworkers went home to families or pets, Izuku returned to a cactus named All Might, which had survived despite his forgetfulness. Still, he liked his routines, they felt comforting. This was his battlefield. This was where he fought. And yes, while it might not involve costumes or battling villains, he was quite skilled at what he did. Weekends, those rare occasions when he actually had time off, were far from glamorous. He often attempted to sleep in, but his body had adapted to the surgical schedule, so sleeping in meant waking up at 6:15 instead of 5. On other occasions, he would try to run errands, which usually ended in mishaps. The last time he went grocery shopping, he got sidetracked by a hero merchandise clearance bin and ended up with 3 All Might mugs but no milk. His mother called him at least twice a week, sometimes to check if he was eating enough and other times to send him articles with titles like, 10 Signs You Need More Vitamin D. He would try to reassure her that he was fine, but she had an uncanny ability to sense when he was lying, which was often. His apartment building was small, where everyone was aware of each other's business whether they liked it or not. Mrs. Takahashi from 4B frequently offered to set him up with her granddaughter, before all the good ones are taken, which Izuku had no polite way to decline except to fake a cough and say he was married to his work. The kids from 2C knocked on his door every other Friday to sell cookies for their hero scout troop. He bought them every time, not just because he enjoyed cookies, which he did, but because they wore little capes and shouted their hero names at him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Embarrassingly, he still had every issue of Hero Weekly stacked in the corner of his bedroom. He told himself he kept them for historical reference, but the truth was, he sometimes just liked flipping through them, admiring the action shots, and wondering yet again what it would feel like to be on the other side of the camera. He wasn't a magnet for trouble like some people, but the universe seemed to enjoy playing tricks on him in small, petty ways. Like last month, when he was halfway to the train station and realized he had left his wallet at home only for it to start raining. Not just any rain, but sideways, typhoon-level rain that left his scrubs clinging to his skin by the time he returned to his apartment. He walked into the lobby dripping wet and had to nod politely to Mr. Endo, the elderly man who often dozed off in the chair by the elevator. There were also occasional encounters with pro-heroes. Not the exciting, cinematic kind. No, Izuku's luck meant they were always oddly mundane. He once shared an umbrella with Kamui Woods while waiting for the train. Another time, he helped Empty Lady carry her groceries up 2 flights of stairs after the elevator broke. And, in what he considered his lowest moment, he accidentally stepped in Ryukyu's path at a crosswalk because he was too busy texting Hitoshi about whether coffee counted as a meal. Speaking of Hitoshi, he was probably the closest thing Izuku had to a brother, which meant half of their conversations were filled with playful insults. "Thanks," Izuku replied, his mouth full of noodles. "It's my natural glow." "You need better hobbies." "I have hobbies." "Name one that doesn't involve a scalpel or medical-grade disinfectant." Izuku couldn't come up with an answer. Despite the late nights, caffeine dependency, and the occasional mishaps with vending machines, he liked his life. It wasn't the dream he once had, but it was his. He couldn't stay in bed forever, lost in thoughts of how content he was. Reality had a way of intruding, whether he wanted it to or not. His alarm buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating so much it nearly fell to the floor, and his phone lit up with the second alarm he had set. With a groan, Izuku dragged a hand over his face and rolled out of bed. His hair looked wild, as if he had been electrocuted in his sleep, an accurate reflection of how he felt most mornings. He shuffled to the bathroom, glanced at his reflection, and decided not to dwell on it. The dream could linger in his mind, but he had to be a person now. Being a person meant being a surgeon with a shift starting in less than an hour. His showers were quick, no fuss. He didn't waste time worrying about his appearance, mostly because he didn't have time, and being in a hospital all day didn't require him to look good. By the end of his shift, he usually looked like he had been through a lot anyway. He jumped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the last remnants of sleep. As quickly as he got in, he got out. His hair dried on its own, having settled into tighter curls that framed his face. He kept it shorter these days, just enough to stay out of the way while working. Physically, he had changed a lot since the days when people called him plain. He wasn't striking like pro heroes or models, but there was something sharper in his features now, perhaps from sleepless nights or the way his frame had leaned out from long hours on his feet. Some nurses had tried asking him out over the last year. He always turned them down politely, not because he wasn't grateful, but because he simply didn't have the time. Dating required energy and emotional investment, and Izuku barely had enough for himself, let alone another person. So, he kept his head down, declined with a smile, and focused on what mattered, his work. Whatever they saw in him, it wasn't the awkward kid he used to be. Once he was out of the shower, his routine became a mad scramble. He toweled off, put on clean scrubs, and started shoving whatever he could grab into his bag, his keys, phone, ID badge, and a granola bar that was probably stale but still edible. Breakfast was whatever he could fit into his mouth on the way out the door, sometimes an apple, sometimes a half-squished protein bar, or just strong coffee. He had promised himself countless times to wake up earlier for a decent meal, but considering he had already overslept today, that clearly wasn't happening. He slung his bag over his shoulder, double-checked that he hadn't left the stove on, and gave a small nod to the cactus on his kitchen counter. "You're in charge while I'm gone," he muttered, preferring talking to All Might the cactus over silence. With that, he slipped into his sneakers and bolted for the door. The hallway outside his apartment buzzed with morning life. Mrs. Takahashi from 4B was wrangling her dog, and the kids from 2C were arguing about which pro-hero was cooler, Kamui Woods or Shudo. Izuku had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from sharing his opinion. "Morning, Midoriya-kun," one of the kids chirped, cape askew and cookie crumbs on his shirt. "Morning," Izuku replied, offering a quick smile as he sidestepped the dog lunging for his ankle. By the time he made it down the stairs and onto the street, the city was alive with its usual chaos. DLVRY trucks honked, vendors set up stalls, and people hustled to work. A hero zipped overhead in a blur of color. Izuku paused for a moment, tilting his head back like the kid he used to be, reminding himself it was just a habit, not longing. The walk to the station was short but felt longer, with his bag sliding off his shoulder and his sneakers squeaking against the pavement. He weaved through the crowd of office workers and students, trying not to spill the coffee he had to stop for to survive his shift at the hospital. The train was packed when he arrived, which was normal. He squeezed inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder between a man in a business suit and a high schooler blasting music through cheap earbuds. Izuku clutched the overhead rail with one hand, coffee balanced in the other, convincing himself this counted as arm strength training. Halfway through the ride, the train jolted to a sudden stop. Izuku braced himself, coffee miraculously unspilled, as the speakers crackled with the familiar announcement, "Delay due to hero activity ahead. Please remain calm." The car collectively groaned, but Izuku leaned toward the window, craning for a glimpse. There it was, a flash of color in the distance, two heroes clashing with a villain near the tracks. He caught a glimpse of the fight for a brief moment before the train lurched forward again, his heart racing. When he finally looked away, he noticed the businessman next to him giving him a curious glance. Izuku lowered his head, sipping his coffee as if it were completely normal to appear awestruck at 24. Izuku nearly missed his stop. One moment he was engrossed in an article about new prosthetic limb technology, and the next, he looked up to see the doors sliding open. He yelped, shoved his phone into his pocket, and hurried through the crowd before the doors closed again. In the process, he almost lost his bag and bumped into a businessman, muttering a string of frantic apologies as he tumbled onto the platform. Unfortunately, his coffee did not survive the chaos. Half the cup splashed onto his scrubs, leaving a dark stain across his chest that made him look like he had encountered a caffeinated villain. He stared down at it in dismay, already hearing Shinsu's teasing voice in his head. With a sigh, he adjusted his bag and continued walking. Just another perfectly average morning. As he entered the hospital, he nodded and offered tired smiles to the people he passed: nurses finishing up night shifts, interns clutching clipboards, and security guards who had already witnessed too much chaos before 8 a.m. A few people did a double take at the coffee stain, but no one said anything. In a hospital, coffee stains were practically part of the uniform. He headed straight for the locker room, grateful for the extra set of scrubs he always kept stashed away. It was a lesson learned the hard way: coffee wasn't even the worst thing he'd ever spilled on himself here. He changed quickly, stuffing the ruined scrubs into his locker and raking his fingers through his curls before declaring himself presentable enough. Today was supposed to be a calm day. No surgeries scheduled, just a handful of patient checkups and maybe a couple of discharges if he thought they were ready to go home. Easy. Low stress. The kind of day he could potentially leave the hospital on time. His first patient of the day was someone who had undergone more surgeries than Izuku had seen in his entire career, and that was saying something. Togata Mirio, the #1 hero in Japan. Even months later, Izuku had to fight the urge not to geek out every time he walked into the room. The first time he'd met Mirio, he had nearly dropped his chart. Mirio was the hero who had taken All Might's place the moment he graduated, filling a void that no one else could. Granted, All Might had retired, and Izuku was not biased when he thought All Might would still be #1 otherwise. But still, having Mirio in his care was surreal. What made it even more challenging was the reason he was there. Strange symptoms had started appearing a few months back, symptoms Izuku had never seen in any hero before. Organs behaving as if they were decades older than they should have been, as if his body was aging from the inside out, far faster than it should. None of the tests provided clear answers, and none of the treatments worked. How do you treat something that doesn't follow the rules of medicine? Izuku had saved dozens of lives, pulling people back from the brink with steady hands and determination. But this situation made him feel helpless in a way that twisted deep in his chest. It wasn't just anyone lying in that bed, it was the #1 hero. And Izuku couldn't fix him. BLD test after BLD test yielded nothing useful about why Mirio's body was acting the way it was. Izuku had done his research, staying up late to scroll through every article and book he could access. The only explanation he found was a grim one: some quirks were too much for the body to handle. Mirio had an immense amount of power, but how was Izuku supposed to fix that if the very thing tearing him apart was his quirk? There was no way to remove a quirk, that was impossible. He had even explored theories about quirks that could restore organs, but nothing concrete emerged. Still, he kept looking and reaching out, even contacting colleagues in America for any leads or connections he hadn't thought of yet. For now, all he could do was keep Mirio monitored, keep running tests, and keep trying. They had just finished another surgery last week, a kidney transplant. Mirio's left kidney had given out, just like the right one had years earlier. Even the new organ didn't seem safe from whatever was happening to him. Izuku hated that feeling, putting his all into repairing someone, only to watch the body betray them anyway. The worst part was that Mirio never stopped smiling through it all. Izuku didn't know how he managed it. Upon entering the room, Izuku found Mirio lying back in his hospital bed, eyes fixed on the window as if he were watching something far away. Izuku wondered if he missed patrolling the rush of the city streets, the thrill of being out there. Probably. "It's pretty today, huh?" Izuku said softly, setting the chart down at the foot of the bed. "Very sunny." "Good morning, document." Mirio turned his head, and the brightness in his smile made the sterile room feel a little less cold. "Good morning, Mr. Togata," Izuku replied automatically, already moving toward the monitor. "What have I told you about that? Call me Mirio. I think we've reached that status by now, don't you?" Mirio chuckled, shaking his head. "We've been over this. It's professional." Izuku couldn't help but smile a little. "Professional, huh?" Mirio's grin widened, making it impossible not to feel lighter even with 4 lines and bandages keeping him tethered. "Well, Doc, if you're going to be the one replacing my organs one by one, I think we've already skipped the professional stage." "That's not exactly how it works," Izuku straightened, tugging at the edge of his coat as if it would make him look less flustered. Mirio just kept watching him with that easy smile. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I could bust through that wall and go patrol right now," Mirio said, jerking his thumb at the window. "But I'll settle for a walk down the hallway if you let me." Izuku shook his head, lips twitching. "You know I can't clear you for hallway demolition yet." "Yet," Mirio repeated, his grin widening. Despite himself, Izuku chuckled, grabbing the chart, flipping it open, and scanning the latest results before clearing his throat. "All right. So your vitals are stable. The new kidney is doing its job, at least for now, and the incision is healing well. If everything continues like this, you should be good to go home tomorrow." Mirio's eyes lit up at the thought of returning home. "Home, huh? Sounds like paradise." "Don't get too comfortable," Izuku replied, his tone shifting back to a professional demeanor. I'll still need you back here once a week for checkups. BLD tests, imaging, monitoring your organs. I want to make sure nothing else is being compromised. Mirio tilted his head, his smile softening. Whatever you say, document. You know I trust you. Izuku swallowed and quickly jotted another note on the chart, needing something to occupy his hands. Yes, he felt flustered, this was still the number one hero after all. He closed the chart but lingered a moment longer. When you go back, he began carefully, you can't push yourself too hard. Your body's still healing. A kidney transplant takes at least 6 weeks before you can even think about real strain. And that's assuming everything goes perfectly. 6 weeks, huh? That's a long time for villains to run around causing trouble. Mirio offered a sheepish grin. I mean it, Izuku pressed, trying not to sound too much like his mom. You can't go crazy. Not yet. He hesitated, searching for the right word. Fragile. Fragile, Mirio repeated, laughing as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Never thought I'd hear that word aimed at me. I'm serious, Izuku insisted, even as a smile threatened to break through. Ease into it. Nothing reckless. Mirio's smile softened, but the spark in his eyes remained. I'll try. But you know how it is, Doc. I've got a lot of people to save. He shifted against the pillows, glancing briefly out the window. I haven't hit 1,000,000 yet. One step at a time, Izuku said quietly. Let's make sure you get there first. Izuku stood there for a moment longer than intended, the chart clutched against his chest. He understood Mirio well enough by now to know he wasn't joking. That dream of saving 1,000,000 people wasn't just a slogan for him. It was something he carried with him, just as Izuku carried his own impossible dream. It troubled him that the one man who could smile through anything was being affected by something he couldn't even name. Surgeons were supposed to fix things, but when he looked at Mirio, all he saw were question marks and uncertainties. All right, Izuku said, clearing his throat. He forced a smile, reminding himself that the patient always came first, no matter what was happening in his own heart. Rest today. Tomorrow we'll talk discharge papers. Thanks, document. Mirio nodded, still smiling brightly. Izuku gave a short wave and slipped out of Mirio's room. He kept his face neutral until the door clicked shut behind him. The moment he was alone in the hallway, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a quiet breath that was half a laugh, half a groan. He had just spent several minutes talking to the number one hero as if it were nothing, as if he hadn't grown up idolizing people like Mirio. A part of him was still that 12-year-old boy, clutching a hero notebook and scribbling facts until his hand cramped. He pressed the chart against his chest for a moment, allowing himself to feel the surreal weight of it all. He was Mirio's doctor. His doctor. He was the one running the tests, planning the follow-ups, and performing the surgeries. And sure, maybe he still got starry-eyed when a hero flew overhead, maybe he still stopped dead on the street just to catch a glimpse of pro-heroes at work. Maybe he was still a fanboy, through and through. But he was also a doctor, trusted to save lives when even their quirks couldn't. As he moved on to his next patient, he thought it wouldn't hurt Mirio to stop smiling so much while his body was healing. It made it difficult for Izuku to appear calm and collected when all he wanted to do was sit down and cry on the man's behalf. By the time Izuku finished his rounds, he was more than ready for a breather. His stomach growled loudly in the elevator, causing a nurse beside him to glance over in surprise. Izuku attempted to cover it with an awkward cough, reminding himself to stay professional. The staff room smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant, a familiar mix by now. He dropped into one of the plastic chairs, tugging his bag into his lap, and rummaged around until he found what could generously be called lunch, a slightly crushed sandwich wrapped in foil. Wow, one of the interns remarked as they walked past. Living the dream, huh, Dr. Midoriya? Don't be jealous, Izuku replied, raising his sandwich in a mock toast. Just as he was about to take a bite, the automatic coffee machine sputtered violently, spraying liquid across the counter and narrowly missing him. Izuku jerked back so quickly that his chair almost tipped over, prompting the intern to burst out laughing. "Machine hates me," he muttered, cheeks flushed as he set the sandwich down. "It's personal." He finally took a bite. Stale bread and too much mustard, definitely not worth the effort, but it didn't matter. Sitting in the break room with the hum of conversation around him, his patience stable for the moment, it was one of those rare pockets of peace amidst the chaos of hospital life. Izuku was halfway through his sandwich when a shadow fell across the table. "Word on the floor is you lost a fight with the coffee machine this morning." "Again?" He looked up to see Nurse Tanaka leaning against the counter, arms crossed and smirking as if she had been waiting all morning to pounce. "It wasn't," Izuku began, then faltered, because technically it had been exactly that. "It malfunctioned," he tried weakly, gesturing toward the machine that was still dripping. "Funny how it only malfunctions when you're the one pressing the button." Tanaka raised an eyebrow. Heat rushed up Izuku's neck. He grabbed his sandwich as if it might shield him. "It's personal," he muttered, sticking to his story. "Machines hate me." "Sure they do, document sure they do." She laughed, shaking her head as she poured herself a fresh cup without spilling a drop. Izuku groaned and dropped his forehead onto the table with a soft thunk. "Professional. Totally professional." "Honestly," Tanaka continued, stirring sugar into her coffee with exaggerated care, "it's kind of impressive. Most people just get caffeine. You get battle scars. I'm not that bad." Izuku lifted his head just enough to glare weakly at her. "You set off the vending machine alarm last week because it ate your coins," she reminded him. "That wasn't my fault," he protested, sitting up straighter. "The machine stole from me. I was simply standing up for justice." "Right," Tanaka said, deadpan. "Hero of the vending machine underdogs. Truly inspiring." Izuku groaned, dragging his hands down his face. "Why does everyone in this hospital think I'm cursed?" "Because you are," came another voice from the doorway. Izuku didn't even need to look up to know who it was. Hitoshi strolled in, still in his detective's coat, holding a can of coffee like he had just walked out of a commercial. "Don't encourage him," Izuku muttered to Tanaka. Hitoshi sat across from him, eyes half-lidded with his usual unimpressed expression. "You spilled coffee on yourself this morning, then picked a fight with a machine you've already lost to 3 times. That's not a curse, Izuku. That's natural selection. You're supposed to be my friend." Izuku pointed his sandwich at him. "I am," Hitoshi said, cracking open his can. "That's why I'm telling you before the machines unionize." Tanaka snorted into her coffee. Izuku sighed, resigned. This was his life. That was Hitoshi Shinso's sarcasm as a first language. They had met years ago when Izuku had been called in to operate on a villain. His hospital didn't pick sides when it came to trauma. A torn artery was a torn artery, whether the hand holding the knife had been saving or taking lives. Hitoshi had been the detective on the case, standing in the corner of the ER, watching with those sharp, unreadable eyes while Izuku stitched the man's heart back together. They had argued briefly about why someone like that deserved another chance. Hitoshi had said something cutting. Izuku had said something stubborn. And somehow, a friendship had formed. Izuku finished chewing his sandwich and narrowed his eyes at Hitoshi. "What are you even doing here? Don't you have an actual job?" "Sure," Hitoshi said, leaning back in his chair and taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But your cafeteria has the best bad coffee in the city. I'd be an idiot not to exploit that." Izuku rolled his eyes. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting," Hitoshi replied smoothly. He had been allowed into the hospital whenever he wanted for years now, technically not protocol, but this was basically Midoriya's domain, and he could bend the rules a little. The only line he wouldn't let Hitoshi cross was the "or" for obvious reasons, but outside of that, the detective could loiter in his office, raid his snack drawer, or haunt the break room without anyone blinking twice. Izuku shook his head, defeated. One of these days, security's going to realize you don't actually work here. Hitoshi smirked, lifting the can in a mock toast. And on that day, I'll make you bail me out. Perks of being your friend. The nurse had bid her goodbye, leaving her empty mug on the counter. Hitoshi's gaze lingered on the door she had left through before sliding back to Izuku. You ever notice the way she looks at you? What? Sparkly eyes, Hitoshi said flatly. Like she's one monologue away from writing your initials in her notebook with little hearts. Izuku nearly choked on the last bite of his sandwich. She does not, he coughed, smacking his chest with his fist, she does not do that. Hitoshi tilted his head. She does. So do half the nurses on this floor. It's embarrassing to watch. Izuku's face went scarlet, and he waved his hands as if that would erase the words from the air. That's ridiculous. They don't nobody I don't even have time to date, okay? Didn't say you did, Hitoshi replied, sipping his coffee like he hadn't just thrown Izuku into a tailspin. Just pointing out the obvious. Some of us notice these things. Izuku groaned and dropped his forehead onto the table. Why are you like this? Gifted, Hitoshi said. Izuku groaned again, muffled into the table. Can we not do this right now? Do what? Hitoshi asked innocently, which was a lie in itself. His smirk gave him away. You know what, Izuku said, lifting his head just enough to glare, cheeks still burning. Hitoshi shrugged, unbothered. I'm just saying, Izuku, you're 24, one of the youngest surgeons in the country, and you spend more time talking to your cactus than to actual people. At some point, Izuku had to admit that his love life was non-existent. He threw his hands up in frustration. I don't have time. Between shifts, surgeries, research, you had time to buy 3 All Might mugs last week, Hitoshi interjected, his expression deadpan. Izuku sputtered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. That was different. It was a clearance sale. Hitoshi leaned back, sipping his coffee with a smugness that suggested he enjoyed this banter. Exactly my point. No time for a date, but plenty of time for hero merchandise. You're hopeless. Izuku groaned, dragging his hands down his face. I hate you. No, you don't, Hitoshi replied. I'm the only one who tells you the truth. Izuku muttered something incoherent, but his ears were still glowing red. Hitoshi set his can down with a quiet clink and studied Izuku with an unreadable expression that usually meant trouble. You know, he drawled, if you're waiting for one of your childhood hero crushes to notice you, you should probably give up now. They don't put world-class surgeon, slightly awkward, talks to plants on dating apps. Izuku sat bolt upright, mortified. I don't have hero crushes. Please, Hitoshi said, unimpressed. You used to memorize their birthdays. That was research. Izuku protested, jabbing his finger at him. For analysis. Aha, Hitoshi said, leaning back in his chair. Totally normal. Most kids make flashcards for math. You made them for All Might. Izuku buried his face in his hands. Why are you like this? Because it's fun, Hitoshi answered smoothly. And because watching you melt down over your tragic, non-existent love life is more entertaining than cable. Izuku groaned again, but the corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. It was easier to take the hits when he knew Hitoshi never meant them to wound. He lowered his hands just enough to peek at him. You know what's really tragic? Do tell. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. You, Izuku said, jabbing his sandwich in Hitoshi's direction like it was a pointer. You sit in a dark office interrogating people for hours, then you come here, drink bad coffee, and insult me. When was the last time you went on a date? Hitoshi blinked slowly, deadpan. Cute. Deflect with a counterattack. You'd make a terrible detective. Izuku grinned, leaning in. No, seriously. You're what? 25. And the most NTMT relationship in your life is with that trench coat you wear everywhere. Hitoshi took a sip of his coffee without breaking eye contact. Bold words from a man who talks to a cactus. Izuku sputtered a laugh, clapping a hand over his mouth to muffle it. Okay, fair. But at least All Might the cactus doesn't smell like stale cigarettes. Hitoshi tilted his head, lips curving just enough to show he was enjoying himself. Careful, Mido. Keep talking and I'll interrogate your cactus. Bet it knows more about your secrets than I do. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Izuku narrowed his eyes, then smirked. Fine. But if you so much as look at All Might the cactus, I'm telling everyone in this hospital about your secret crush on the number 44 hero, Chargebolt. For the first time that morning, Hitoshi actually sputtered mid-sip. What? He coughed, glaring. How do you even know he's ranked 44? Because of course I know. Izuku's grin widened. Hitoshi set his coffee down with exaggerated care. You're insufferable. And you, Izuku said sweetly, are deflecting. Hitoshi dragged a hand down his face, then leveled Izuku with a flat stare. You know, it's actually impressive. Most people outgrow their hero obsession by middle school. But not you. You just doubled down. I did not. Izuku's mouth fell open. You stitched Lemillion's kidney back in and couldn't tell if it was the right time for an autograph, Hitoshi deadpanned. That's, Izuku flailed, cheeks burning, that's completely slander. Tell yourself whatever helps you sleep, fanboy. Hitoshi smirked, leaning back in his chair. Izuku groaned, hiding his face in his hands. Why did he even try to turn the tables? With Hitoshi, it always came back around twice as sharp. Hitoshi leaned back, clearly satisfied with how red Izuku's ears had gotten, and then waved a hand like he was brushing the whole thing aside. Anyway, back to the real reason I'm here. You actually had a reason. Always. Hitoshi smirked. Think you'll be out on time this shift? There's a new restaurant downtown I want to try. Supposed to be 5 stars. But I don't feel like sitting there by myself looking like a loser. Izuku blinked, caught off guard. You came all the way to the hospital to invite me to dinner. Better odds of catching you here than if I text. Half the time you ignore me, the other half you're elbow deep in somebody's chest cavity. Hitoshi shrugged, taking a long sip. Izuku's face flamed again, though this time it wasn't just embarrassment. That's not fair, he muttered. I don't ignore you. I'm just busy. Busy, Hitoshi echoed flatly. Right. So, what's it gonna be, document dinner after work, or do I let your cactus friend know you stood me up? Izuku groaned into his hands again, but this time he was smiling. Fine. Yes. Dinner. Just don't pick a place where I have to wear a tie. Knew you'd say yes. Hitoshi pulled out his phone and started typing. I'll text Mina, see what time she gets off patrol. Because if we go without her, she'll find out. Oh, right. Yeah. Definitely tell Mina. Izuku winced. He didn't need to be reminded. The last time he and Hitoshi had made plans without looping her in, Mina had discovered it through sheer intuition and hunted them down mid-meal. Izuku still had flashbacks of the way she'd slammed her hands on their table, eyes glowing with betrayal as she declared, so you two thought you could have fun without me. They'd both sworn never to repeat the mistake. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. I'm not interested in dying that young. Smart choice, Hitoshi said, sending the text off with a satisfied little click. The break room door cracked open again. It was Nurse Tanaka, the same one who teased him about the coffee machine earlier, only now, her eyes were wide, and she looked a little flushed, like she'd just sprinted up 3 flights of stairs. Dr. Midoriya," she said, voice pitched higher than usual. "You, have someone waiting for you. In urgent care. Someone. Like a walk-in." Izuku blinked. Tanaka gave him a look that was equal parts starstruck and horrified. "Not just someone. Well, this girl is asking for you. And she's with, the number 2 hero. Wow. Didn't know you took celebrity appointments." Hitoshi leaned back in his chair, smirking. Izuku froze. Number 2 hero. That didn't make sense. Heroes didn't know who he was, at least, not like that. Sure, his name had made the rounds in medical journals and the occasional article that got picked up by mainstream news, prodigy surgeon saves hero with record-breaking operation. But still, he never really thought of himself as, known. "Are you sure?" he asked weakly, standing up. Tanaka just gestured toward the hall, looking like she was about to faint if she had to say it twice. "Well, I'm not moving." Shinso didn't even glance up from his coffee. "Good luck, though. Don't faint." Izuku groaned but got to his feet anyway, following Tanaka out into the hall. When they reached urgent care, it didn't take long to spot the pair waiting. The girl, long brown hair pulled into a ponytail, waving cheerfully like she was greeting an old friend, was Kami Yatsushimi. She radiated energy, talking fast enough that the staff milling nearby didn't seem sure whether to laugh along or make a run for it. And next to her, standing stiff with his hands shoved into his pockets, was Todoroki Shudo, the number 2 hero. Izuku's breath caught. Kami spotted him immediately and lit up even brighter. "Yo. You're Midoriya, right? Heard from a birdie who heard from another birdie that you're, like, the guy. The prodigy doc. The legend. So." She clapped a hand on Todoroki's shoulder, ignoring the way he flinched at the contact. "This one doesn't like hospitals, but I dragged him here anyway." "Pretty cool, huh?" Todoroki said nothing, just stared at Izuku with that calm, unreadable gaze. Izuku's mind raced between the excitement of meeting Todoroki Shudo and the surprise of being called a legend. Out loud, he managed, "Hi." Kami, still talking a mile a minute, gestured vaguely toward Todoroki's face. "So, like, here's the deal, document. For the past couple of days, his left side's been all," she wiggled her fingers, making an explosion noise with her mouth. "Funky. He says it's nothing, but he's been getting these headaches, and sometimes he zones out, and also there was this one time he nearly face-planted during patrol and pretended it was strategy." She leaned in, stage whispering loudly enough for the entire ward to hear. "It wasn't strategy." Todoroki didn't even blink. Kami exaggerates. Izuku, caught between starstruck and confused, tilted his head. "Your left side." His eyes flicked toward the burn scar that stretched across Todoroki's left eye, then quickly darted away. "Does it happen when you're using your quirk?" "Not always," Todoroki said flatly. "It's fine." Kami snorted. "It's not fine. He hasn't been sleeping, either. I practically had to drag him here." Izuku swallowed, pulling himself back into professional mode. "Right. Okay. Why don't we go somewhere private, and I'll check a few things." Todoroki gave him a long look, then finally nodded. Izuku pressed a stethoscope against Todoroki's chest, listening carefully as he ran through the basics: heart rhythm, lungs, vitals. Everything seemed normal, but there was tension in Todoroki's body, like every muscle was coiled and ready to resist. "Any dizziness? Shortness of breath?" Izuku asked gently. "No." "Fatigue?" "No." "Headaches?" A pause. "Sometimes." Izuku scribbled notes onto the chart, then glanced up. "I'll have the nurse schedule some lab tests, BLD work, imaging, just to rule out anything more serious." "You don't need to," Todoroki said, his eyes flat. "It's unnecessary. I'm fine." Izuku set the pen down, meeting his gaze. Maybe. But she's a good friend if she's worried about you over something small. For the first time, Todoroki's expression flickered. Izuku leaned back, chewing his lip. Something wasn't adding up. The headaches, the zoning out, the left side issues, all on the side of his fire quirk, the one he famously avoided. And suddenly, the pieces clicked. I think I know what's happening, Izuku said slowly. Your quirk isn't balanced. You're only using your ice side, right? If you don't regulate your temperature with the fire side, your body compensates your overloading one half. Todoroki's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Izuku softened his voice. The solution's simple, actually. Use your fire. Balance it out. That should stop the symptoms before they get worse. Silence stretched between them. Todoroki's eyes, cool and unreadable, flicked away toward the wall. It's not that simple. Todoroki's eyes narrowed just slightly. No. There has to be another explanation. I'm not using my fire. Izuku set his chart down a little harder than necessary, his lips twitching like he was fighting the urge to roll his eyes. With all due respect, actually, no, scratch that. Respect or not, if you keep this up, you're only going to get worse. You'll end up back here every other week with headaches, fatigue, or worse. And last I checked, the number 2 hero doesn't exactly have time for frequent hospital visits. Todoroki's jaw tightened. It's manageable. Manageable. Izuku's voice lifted, incredulous. How are you supposed to save people when you can't even stand without feeling like your head splitting in half? Are you going to fight villains in 10-second bursts between migraines? That's not manageable. That's reckless. For the first time, Todoroki's eyes sharpened on him, cool and probing. Why are you insisting so much on the fire? Because it's my professional opinion. If you don't use your fire side, your symptoms will continue. And if you want to keep being a hero, if you want to keep saving people, then you need to start giving it your all, not just half. Todoroki's eyes narrowed. Why are you so insistent? It's suspicious. Did my father, his voice was flat but sharp, cutting, pay you to say this? Did he bribe you to convince me to use my fire? Izuku blinked, momentarily taken aback. Wait. What? I wouldn't put it past him, Todoroki continued coldly. He's tried everything else. Why not this? Izuku's mouth opened, then closed again. His brain scrambled between outrage and disbelief. You think the previous number 2 hero Endeavor called me, paid me off, and convinced me to push you to use your fire, all in the 5 minutes between when your friend dragged you into this hospital and I walked into this room. Izuku's voice rose as he spoke, his hands gesturing wildly. Did Kami call your dad on the way here? Was this all some elaborate conspiracy? Really? Todoroki's eyes flickered, not backing down, but faltering just slightly as the logic cut through his accusation. You just insulted my practice. The years of school I clawed my way through. The debt I'm still in. You think I'd throw all of that away to be someone's puppet? To get bribed? He jabbed his pen against the chart in his hands, his green eyes burning. I didn't become the youngest surgeon in Japan because people paid me off. I became the best because I worked hard for it. And I'll be d'med if anyone, even the number 2 hero, tries to belittle that. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Todoroki stared at him, expression still cool, but his posture had shifted. The unshakable confidence wavered, just slightly. The accusation he'd thrown out in blind anger didn't hold under the weight of Izuku's conviction. I'm insisting on your fire because you're not the number 2 hero right now. You're a patient. A patient with symptoms that could be fixed easily if you stopped being so stubborn. He leaned forward, eyes bright. I'm insisting because once you leave this room, you'll go back to being a hero, and I want you to be able to give it your all when you're out there saving people who need you. Because I look up to you. Because when I'm a civilian on the streets, and I'm on my way to work and a villain decides to stir up some trouble, you stop them. You are my hero. He continued. But you're not my hero right now. You're my patient. And I won't let you suffer because you're too stubborn. The room went utterly still. Todoroki's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes shifted, like he'd just been struck somewhere deep. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Just stared at him with that unreadable calm that somehow felt heavier than if he'd shouted back. Izuku's stomach twisted. He had just raised his voice at the number 2 hero. In a hospital room. Where other people could probably hear. Fantastic. Way to ruin his career before 30. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, he said finally, softer now. I got carried away. I shouldn't have snapped like that. So yeah. I'm sorry. For that part. He straightened, though, his voice firm again. But I'm not sorry for insisting. I meant every word. I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. I've sacrificed years of my life to get here, but not once would I ever take a bribe to put a patient at risk. Not for your father. Not for anyone. Izuku paused, then held the chart out, his tone settling back into clipped professionalism. Head downstairs to the lab. They'll take some samples, run some tests. If there's another solution that doesn't involve using your quirk, I'll find it. That's my job. For a moment, Todoroki's gaze lingered on him, unreadable as ever. Then, without a word, he turned and headed for the door. Izuku let out a long breath the second it clicked shut. Great, he muttered to himself. Definitely nailed that. Totally didn't just yell at the number 2 hero. Fantastic. Todoroki pulled the door open without a word, slipping out into the hall. Izuku followed a few steps behind, trying to tuck his chart under his arm as if the argument hadn't just happened. Cammy was waiting in the chairs near the wall, bouncing one leg and scrolling on her phone. The moment she spotted them, she lit up and sprang to her feet. Yo! That was fast. What's the verdict, document? Izuku cleared his throat, pointedly keeping his eyes on the chart in his hands. He needs labs. Can you take him downstairs and get them done? His gaze flicked to Todoroki, then back to Cammy. And, if he asks to SWCH doctors after this, I won't be offended. Cammy blinked at him, then broke into a grin. Pfft. Please. If Shudo didn't want you as his doc, he would have frozen the door shut on his way out. He's here, isn't he? You're good. Izuku opened his mouth, then shut it again, unsure how to respond to that kind of logic. Cammy tilted her head, her smile softening just a little. But, everything's okay with him, right? Izuku forced his tone even and professional. It's nothing serious right now. Cammy beamed, as if that was the best news she'd heard all day. Awesome. See, Shudo. Told you it'd be fine. She looped her arm through Todoroki's without waiting for permission and started dragging him toward the elevators, chattering the whole way. Izuku watched them go, running a hand down his face. He'd definitely need to stress eat something later. By the time Izuku pushed back into the break room, regret was already gnawing at him. He dropped his chart onto the nearest counter, slumped into a chair, and buried his face in his hands. Why had he yelled at Todoroki? He didn't even know. It wasn't something he should have gotten so defensive about, and now it probably looked suspicious. As if getting heated like that meant he was guilty of something. Which he wasn't. His defensiveness wasn't guilt, it was frustration. Watching someone with such an incredible quirk throw half of it away was maddening. Knowing there were people born without anything, people like him, who would have given anything to have that kind of power, made it even harder to understand why Todoroki was burning himself out instead of using the fire he'd been born with. Izuku let out a bitter laugh into his palms. Maybe he really did need therapy. Still, He could understand why Todoroki hadn't said anything after his outburst. If he were in Todoroki's shoes, he probably would have just walked out too. But the whole situation was insane. Putting his body through so much just because he refused to use his own quirk. And then to throw that accusation about his father into the mix, there was definitely something deeper there, something Izuku couldn't even begin to imagine. He lifted his head, rubbing tiredly at his eyes. The contrast between the top two heroes couldn't have been sharper. Mirio was sunlight personified, vibrant and grinning like tomorrow was guaranteed, no matter how many surgeries or hospital stays he had behind him. He reminded Izuku so much of All Might that it almost hurt. That same warmth filled a room and made people believe they were safe just because he was there. And then there was Todoroki. Stoic and cold, with eyes like a shuttered window. He was strength contained in silence, a wall instead of a beacon. In some twisted way, it felt like watching All Might and Endeavor all over again. Izuku leaned back in his chair, exhaling deep thoughts, a voice drawled. Izuku jumped, whipping his head up to see Hitoshi lounging in the corner with coffee in hand, eyes half-lidded and a smirk on his face. How what? Izuku stammered, clutching his chest. You're still here. Obviously. Hitoshi took a lazy sip. Hospital coffee may be terrible, but it's still free. Now, his gaze sharpened, how was Japan's number 2 hero? Did you tell him you're his number 1 fan? Izuku groaned and dropped into the chair across from him, burying his face in his hands. I think I yelled at him. There was a pause. Then Shinsu's smirk spread slowly. Oh, this is good. You yelled at Shudo Todoroki. Please, elaborate. He accused me of being bribed, Izuku mumbled through his palms. By his father. To make him use his fire quirk. And then I just snapped. I told him he wasn't my hero, he was my patient. I basically ranted. Loudly. At the number 2 hero. Hitoshi took another deliberate sip. Incredible. Truly. If I'd known this day was coming, I would have brought popcorn. Izuku peeked out from between his fingers, cheeks burning. I ruined it, didn't I? He's probably going to request another doctor. Or worse, file a complaint. If he files a complaint, it's not your fault, Hitoshi cut in, leaning back in his chair with a shrug. You were offended, and you defended yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. Heroes don't need more people kissing their buttes. They need someone who'll call them out when they're being foolish. Sounds like you did your job. Izuku blinked at him, stunned. His chest still felt tight, but a little less crushing. He let out a shaky breath that came out half laugh, half groan. You make everything sound so simple. That's because it is, Hitoshi deadpanned. A pause. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Also because I want to see if Todoroki comes back just to watch you panic again. That's entertainment. Izuku grabbed the nearest napkin and threw it at him. No way. No freaking way, Zuku, Mina said, practically doubled over the table, hands pressed to her cheeks as she laughed. You yelled at Todoroki. You. At the number 2 hero. I don't believe it. Izuku groaned and dropped his face into his hands, already dying from embarrassment. Can we not? Oh, we can, Hitoshi interrupted smoothly, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. Dr. Midoriya, bravely telling off the number 2 hero. Truly the scandal of the decade. Mina slapped the table, nearly spilling her drink. Hitoshi, stop. I can't breathe. I can't either, Izuku muttered, muffled against his palms. Every time he thought about that moment in the exam room, his words, Todoroki's unreadable stare, the silence afterward, he cringed. It had been running on repeat in his head all shift. Honestly, it was a miracle he'd made it through the rest of the day without tripping over his own feet. There had been much to distract him. The shift had been slow. No surgeries scheduled, no complications, just rounds and check-ins that somehow evaporated the hours. It had been the fastest shift he'd ever worked. Which, of course, still didn't stop him from being late to dinner. 6 minutes late. Mina had let him have it the second he sat down, like he'd personally committed a crime. It was their dynamic, though. Mina Ashido was a professional hero and perhaps Izuku's best friend in the world. Their friendship had begun years ago during his residency when Mina had come into the ER after a reckless stunt on patrol. Although she wasn't critically injured, she had enough scrapes and bruises that Izuku helped her through her recovery. From that moment on, she had decided he was hers. She often referred to him as her lifesaver, a nickname that stuck. Mina had a way of embedding herself into his life so thoroughly that he couldn't imagine it without her. She was a force of nature, bright and unyielding, and Izuku had been swept along before he even realized it. He often wondered why she chose to stay by his side, but he was grateful she did. Mina was the kind of friend who would drop everything if Izuku mentioned he had free time. It didn't even have to be an emergency. If he texted her on a random Tuesday night saying he had a couple of hours off, she would abandon whatever she was doing just to hang out. This behavior often raised eyebrows, leading to rumors that they might be secretly dating. However, that was far from the truth. Izuku didn't see Mina in that way, and she didn't see him that way either. Her romantic interests were often focused on a certain red-haired hero she could never quite figure out. Anyway, Mina said, snapping him back to the present with a grin, "Don't sweat it so much. Todoroki's always been like that. I wouldn't take it seriously." Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. "Right. I forget you actually went to school with him." His tone was casual, but Izuku sensed the underlying discomfort. Hitoshi didn't like discussing UA, not out of bitterness, but it was close enough. Mina either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Yeah," Mina shrugged, spearing a piece of food with her chopsticks. "He never made friends, never wanted to. He made it clear he was only at UA to become a hero, not to socialize. Honestly, he was kind of intimidating. Nobody could break through his bubble. Not even me, and you know how I can get anyone to talk to me." Izuku smiled faintly, but his mind was racing. If even Mina hadn't cracked Todoroki's ice wall, how had Kami managed it? She was loud and bright, similar to Mina, but Mina had gone to school with Todoroki while Kami hadn't. Izuku had never heard Mina mention Kami being in their class. Now he was curious. He couldn't believe how many people in his life had attended UA. Mina had been in class 1A, and so had Tsuyu. Mina was his chaotic friend, always showing up in the ER with some reckless injury, grinning while he treated her. Tsuyu, on the other hand, had come into his ER as a rescuer. The first time he met her, she had walked in with a group of civilians, soaked from the rain, guiding them through triage with a gentle yet firm demeanor. Hours later, she returned, not for herself, but to check on the people she had saved. That had impressed him. Most heroes didn't do that. It was impossible to keep track of every face in the chaos of hero work, but Froppy remembered every time. That was how their conversations began. It was easy with Tsuyu. Then, to his surprise, he discovered that Mina and Tsuyu already knew each other from UA. One day, Mina had barged into his office mid-conversation with Tsuyu, and they had shrieked like long-lost sisters. That was how their group formed: Mina, Tsuyu, Izuku, and Hitoshi, who was always around Izuku and, by extension, always around them. None of them had chosen this dynamic, but it had stuck. Somehow, the four of them had woven their lives together. Honestly, Mina continued, you shouldn't be that offended. Todoroki's fire side has always been a sensitive topic for him. It literally cost him the sports festival. He refused to use it. The only reason Katsuki won was that Shudo held himself back. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Even during the cavalry battle, poor Ida was begging him to use his fire, but nope. Ice, ice, ice. He lost so many points that way. I mean, you guys watched the sports festival, right? Izuku blinked, caught off guard, then let out a small laugh. Yeah. Of course I did. He had watched every single one, every year. Even after failing to get into UA, he hadn't missed a broadcast. The sports festival was more than just entertainment for Izuku. Maybe it was a bit sad, but whenever he watched, part of him imagined himself out there too, a phantom version of himself in a uniform he'd never wear, doing things he'd never do. Izuku remembered that match vividly. Katsuki had won, but what stuck with him was the way Katsuki had looked furious, rage boiling out of him as if winning wasn't enough. So, Izuku began, rolling Mina's previous words around in his head, trying to steer his thoughts away from the explosive blonde. Todoroki had never really made friends, which aligned with what he had seen earlier, walls built so high that no one could climb them, except apparently Kami, who had somehow managed to find a way in. He really never made any friends. Mina shook her head, her lips pursed. Nope. Everybody tried, you know. You see a quiet guy and think he's just shy, that it'll be easy to pull him out of his shell. But nope. He was polite enough, but not interested at all. He made it pretty clear he wasn't there to make friends, just to train. Izuku hummed softly, slipping into thought. Oh, Hitoshi interrupted dryly, pointing his chopsticks at him. Earth to Midoriya. Don't do that. Izuku blinked. Do what? That. Hitoshi gestured at his face. Thinking in silence. It's creepy. You usually mutter so much that people need subtitles to keep up, and when you just shut up and make that face, it's scary, Mina finished, nodding solemnly. Super scary. Like you're plotting world domination or something. Izuku laughed, feeling embarrassed. I'm not scary. You are when you don't make noise, Hitoshi replied flatly. Stick to muttering. At least then they knew what was going on in the whirlwind of thoughts. Shaking his head, Izuku smiled and set his chopsticks down. I was just thinking. Mina, did you ever have a girl named Kami in your class? Kami. Mina tilted her head, frowning in thought. No, let's see. There was Ochako, Tsuyu, Yaoyorozu, Jairu, Hagakure, nope. No Kami. Izuku hummed again, leaning back in his chair. Huh. Mina squinted at him, suspicious. What do you mean, huh? Don't just, huh, and then clam up. Spill. I can't. It's patient confidentiality, oh my god, Hitoshi cut in, voice flat. Bro. You literally said he's going to SWCH. Doctors. Relax. Izuku groaned, scrubbing at his face. Fine. It's just he came with a friend. And since you're telling me he's not the type to have friends, I was curious how that even happened. Because she's very much like you, Mina. Very bubbly. Big energy. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Do you think they're dating? Is she his girlfriend? Mina gasped, eyes going wide. Izuku's face turned red immediately. What? No, I don't know, Mina. I don't know. And I guess we'll never know, because he's definitely going to SWCH doctors after today. Boo-hoo, Mina sing-songed, leaning back with a grin. Hitoshi smirked, resting his chin on his hand. It'd be hilarious if he didn't SWCH doctors. You'd combust every appointment. Izuku groaned again, dropping his head onto his folded arms. Speaking of friendships and relationships, Hitoshi pivoted smoothly, glancing at Mina, how's yours going? Don't ask. Mina immediately dropped her head onto the table with a loud thunk. That bad? Izuku lifted his head just enough to blink at her. Worse, she muttered into the wood. Why is dating so complicated? Maybe it's complicated, Hitoshi said slowly, because it's a one-sided relationship. Mina's head snapped up, glare sharp enough to cut glass. Excuse me. Hitoshi didn't even flinch. You heard me. Izuku winced, but then, well, he couldn't not agree. I mean, he has a little bit of a point, Mina. Traitor, Mina hissed at him. Izuku held up his hands. I'm just saying you can't really expect Kirishima to, give you his all if he doesn't even know he's in a relationship with you. Mina groaned, dropping back into her chair with a dramatic flop. Well, he'll never know, because he'd never look at me that way. Ever. Izuku softened, leaning forward. You don't know that unless you try. Hitoshi tilted his head. Right now you've basically got him trapped in a situation he doesn't even know about. You should at least let him negotiate. Izuku burst out laughing, clapping a hand over his mouth too late. Mina threw her napkin at Hitoshi, who dodged with a lazy lean. I hate you both, Mina announced, but there was no real heat behind it. The worst friends. Actual villains. Villains who tell you the truth, Hitoshi corrected smoothly, sipping his water. Izuku was still grinning as he added, and villains who want you to be happy. It's just so hard to tell someone you've known your whole life that you like them. Mina groaned again, hiding her face in her hands this time. Well, yeah, I can imagine. You've known Kirishima since, what, middle school? Izuku tilted his head. Exactly, Mina said, muffled by her palms. She peeked out long enough to glare at him. Which makes it even worse. Like, I'm supposed to see him as a brother, right? I don't know, Hitoshi drawled. You can see him however you want. It's not your fault your heart developed feelings for him. Yeah, but what if I'm confusing them? What if it's just because I've known him so long that I think I should like him? Mina slumped further. Mina. You've known me for years too. Do you like me? Izuku leaned forward. Her head shot up so fast it nearly smacked the table. No offense, but no. No. You're like my little brother. Not offended, Izuku said with a small smile. But see. You know when you have feelings for someone. Even if you've known them forever. So what's scaring you so much? Because I don't think it's the telling him part. You've never been scared to tell people how you feel. For once, Mina didn't answer. She just pressed her hands harder against her face, hiding from both of them. Hitoshi blinked. Then his lips curled into a slow smirk. Oh wow. We hit something. This is the first time she's ever shut up. Shut the hell up, Hitoshi, Mina snapped without looking up. You're scared because you don't want to ruin what you already have with him, aren't you? You like the way things are, and if you tell him, it might change everything. And you don't want to lose him. Izuku's voice gentled. There was a long silence. Mina peeked between her fingers, glaring faintly. When did you finally become a therapist? About 10 seconds ago, Hitoshi said smoothly. And he'll be charging you double for the session. Izuku leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I get it, Mina. It's scary. Because yeah, it could change things. But imagine if that's how he felt too. If he liked you back, wouldn't that solve all of this? All your one-sided, non-existent relationship problems. Because right now he doesn't even know you're mentally in a relationship with him. Ugh, don't say it like that. It sounds worse when you say it out loud. Mina dragged her hands down her face with a groan. But it's true, Izuku said, though his voice was gentle. I don't know, Mina sighed, shoulders slumping. It's just hard. I can't tell if he likes me. And I don't want to tell him if he doesn't, because I'd rather keep him as a friend than lose him forever, you know. If I tell him and he doesn't feel the same, it'll make things awkward. And I don't want that. Especially since we have so many mutual friends. Izuku hummed quietly. She had a point, the squad was practically a second family. He understood why Mina would hesitate. I don't want it to ruin anything between our friends either, Mina continued, fiddling with her straw. I'd hate for them to have to pick sides. We're all so close, and I never want to be the reason things split. Her voice dropped, smaller now. And besides, I don't even know if he feels the same. Because it's Kirishima. He's always so friendly with everyone. Hugging, high fives, all that. He's like this giant golden retriever, right? He's touchy and warm with everyone, so how am I supposed to tell if it means something when he does it with me? I'm basically just one of the brothers. Her eyes widened as she dramatically placed a hand on her forehead. Oh no. I am one of those girls, aren't I? The ones who are like, yeah, I'm one of the guys. Hitoshi finally interjected, his voice dry. Well, you kinda are one of the guys. I mean, look at your friend groups. When you're not with us, it's basically a lineup of guys. Mina sat up straighter, pointing a finger at him. That is not true. I hang out with Tsuyu, and Achiko, and Kyoka sometimes. Hitoshi tilted his head, his expression flat. Aha. And who are you hanging out with right now? He gestured around the table. And who do you hang out with when we're not free? Mina's mouth opened and closed, then she puffed out her cheeks. Poof. Izuku bit back a laugh, trying to soften it. Okay, but seriously. Why don't you just ask the others in your group what they think? Maybe they've noticed something you haven't. You know, outside perspective. No way. Mina shook her head furiously, her pink curls bouncing. Absolutely not. That would make everything 1,000 times more awkward. If the whole squad knew. Ugh, I'd never live it down. So then why do you keep inviting us to hang out with your squad? If you don't want anyone catching on to your crush, maybe don't put yourself in the blast zone. Hitoshi arched an eyebrow. Because. Mina threw her hands up. Because I want you guys there as, like moral support, duh. Nobody in the squad knows I like him. Nobody. But if I have you guys around, at least I can. I don't know, lean on someone when I feel like I'm gonna combust. Or when I say something silly. Or when I almost cry because he ruffles my hair and calls me mince like I'm just one of the guys. Her hand smacked down on the table with a thud. You two are my backup emotional support crew, okay? Deal with it. Izuku blinked, then smiled a little. I mean. I think that's kind of sweet. It's codependency. But sure. Sweet. Hitoshi sipped his drink, deadpan. Okay, Mina. I'm gonna repeat what I always tell you. Izuku smiled. Don't. Not the speech. Mina groaned, dragging her hands down her face. Yes, the speech, Izuku insisted. Look, it's okay to feel this way. It's normal. But I always tell you, you just have to be upfront. The best thing you can do is tell someone how you really feel. Because one day, he paused, frowning slightly as he searched for the right words. One day it's going to slip out anyway. And when it does, it won't be the way you want it. It'll be messy, and unplanned, and worse, you won't have any control over it. Wouldn't you rather choose how and when? Mina made a muffled noise into her palms, despairing. Ugh. You make it sound so simple, but it's not. I can't. I'm literally doomed. Hitoshi leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink like he'd been waiting for this exact line. Finally. She admits it. Shut up, Hitoshi. Mina peeked through her fingers just to glare at him. As Mina groaned into her hands, something twisted in Hitoshi's chest. Because wasn't he a hypocrite? Be upfront. Tell them how you really feel. He could say it 1,000 times to her, but when it came to himself, when it came to the ache of wanting a quirk, of wanting to be a hero, he kept it all locked tight. Safer that way. maybe Mina was right. Maybe they were all doomed in their own ways. Hitoshi stirred his coffee lazily, breaking Izuku's spiral before it went too far. So what's the plan then, Mina? You going to confess, or keep dragging us into your soap opera until Izuku loses all his hair from stress? Mina deadpanned, flicking a balled-up napkin at his head. Izuku laughed under his breath, but his own words still echoed in his mind. Wouldn't you rather choose how and when? Mina groaned dramatically, letting her forehead thunk onto the table again. I don't know, okay? I don't know, and it's getting harder by the day. But I don't want to bore you guys with this whole conversation, so let's just move on. Izuku blinked at her. Mina, you literally talk about this every day. He leaned forward, soft but earnest. And we've never once been bored. We're here for you. Exactly, Hitoshi added dryly, stirring his straw around his glass of iced tea. Your love life is the only drama I subscribe to. If you stop, I'll have to go back to actual television. Mina lifted her head just enough to squint at him. You're the worst. I know, he said cheerfully. She sighed, collapsing back into her hands. Okay, well, it's getting harder. It's easy when we're on joint patrols, you know. Because then my brain switches to hero mode. Priorities. Save people first, crush later. But when it's just the two of us hanging out, she slapped her palms over her eyes and groaned again. I have no idea how to control it. I feel like my heart's gonna explode every 2 seconds. And it's getting worse. Like, progressively worse. Izuku glanced at Hitoshi, who was already smirking like this was the juiciest part of the story. Then he turned back to Mina and said gently, well, maybe that's a sign it's not going away. And maybe that's why you need to, don't say it, she warned, muffled behind her fingers. If you say confess again, I'll scream. Do it, Izuku. Make her scream in public. Hitoshi tipped his chair back with a slow grin. Izuku threw a napkin at his head. Okay, okay. Izuku lifted both hands in surrender, laughing a little despite himself. I won't say confess. Too late. Mina wailed dramatically, throwing her head back and letting out a loud, exaggerated scream that made the neighboring table glance over. Hitoshi choked on his drink, laughing so hard he had to cover his mouth. Worth it, he managed between coughs. That was everything I wanted. Glad I could entertain you, Mina muttered, cheeks pink as she slumped against the table again. Izuku shook his head, still smiling faintly. Look, I'm serious. I'm not saying you have to do anything right this second. But at least, keep it in mind, okay? You're so convinced it'll never work, but you've never even given yourself the chance to see if it could. Just, think about it. Really think about it. Mina peeked at him from behind her hands, her expression caught between touched and skeptical. Izuku leaned forward a little, his voice gentling. I just don't want to see you get hurt. Because if you keep holding it in and something else happens like he starts dating someone, or he moves on without ever knowing how you felt, you'll regret it. And I don't want that for you. There was a pause as Mina puffed out her cheeks and blew out a long sigh. You're too nice, Zuku. You're supposed to be on my side, not making me face reality. I am on your side, Izuku said softly. That's why I'm telling you. Hitoshi leaned back, smirking as if he'd been waiting for the opening. Congratulations, Midoriya. You've officially unlocked your therapist arc. At this rate, we'll need to start paying you hourly. Why do I even talk? Izuku groaned, burying his face in his hands again. Mina was still chewing over his words, twisting her straw between her fingers. Slowly, she lifted her head. Okay. Fine. Let's say I do it. Hypothetically. If I tell him, you guys have to be there. Like, in the vicinity. For moral support. No excuses. Izuku blinked. Wait, What, I'm serious, Zuku. Mina pointed at him and then at Hitoshi. If I tell Ijiro and he rejects me, I'll actually die. I can't rely on Denki or Hanta to pick up the pieces, they just make jokes until I cried harder. And Katsuki, she cut herself off, groaning. God. Katz would probably try to comfort me in his own way, but it'd be like, ugh. Super blunt. He'd tell me to man up, that it's not the end of the world, it's just a guy, and that it'd be Ijiro's loss, not mine. Which, sure, sounds nice, but it wouldn't help. Because it would feel like my loss. And he just, wouldn't get that. Izuku's stomach tightened. That didn't sound like the Kaken he knew. The Kaken he remembered would have laughed and dismissed her feelings outright, calling her pathetic for crying over something so stupid. But the way Mina said it, that was not the Kaken from their middle school hallways. That was someone else entirely. Someone Izuku couldn't quite picture, no matter how hard he tried. It was always strange to Izuku how Mina, of all people, had managed to befriend someone like him. Because to Izuku, Katsuki wasn't Katz. He was Kaken. Still frozen in time as the boy from middle school, the one who carved himself into Izuku's memory with every insult and every shove. Katsuki had been mean, no, not just mean, but cruel. Cruel enough to tell Izuku, more than once, that the world would be better if he just didn't exist. And yet, even then, even hearing words that should have shattered him, Izuku had never once considered it. Not seriously. Not when he still had his mom, and he knew what it would do to her if he disappeared. That had been enough to hold him steady. There was also a part of him, some small, stubborn part of him that never quite believed Katsuki really meant it. But that wasn't a question Izuku would ever ask. Not then. Not now. Especially not when he hadn't seen Katsuki in years. Izuku's feelings toward him were jagged and messy. Once, Kaken had been everything. An idol, someone who burned so bright it hurt to look at him. Izuku had worshipped that brightness even as it scorched him raw. He'd let himself believe Kaken could do no wrong. And maybe that was the most pathetic part, he hadn't just endured the abuse. He'd admired the person who dealt it. And what had that devotion gotten him? Bruises and scars. A voice in his head that still sometimes whispered worthless, quirkless, useless. He hated Katsuki for it. But maybe worse, he hated himself for never fighting back, for never saying stop, for letting someone who called him loser define the word victory in his mind. So hearing Mina drop his name so casually, like Katz was just another friend, it was surreal. Unbearably surreal. Because Katz sounded like someone Izuku had never met, gruff but loyal, sharp-edged but dependable, someone people trusted. Mina's Katsuki didn't line up with the one carved into Izuku's head at all. And maybe that was the worst part, the possibility that Katsuki had changed. That he had become someone better, someone worth keeping, for everyone except Izuku. When did he change? The thought was a needle slipping under his skin, sharp and unwelcome. Izuku had never told Mina that he'd known Katsuki since they were little. Since before quirks. He didn't think Katsuki would want anyone to know, not that he used to waste his time with a quirkless loser. And sometimes Izuku didn't want to admit it either. Because what did that say about him? That he'd let himself be tethered for so long to someone who delighted in stepping on him. That he'd spent years mistaking cruelty for strength. It was easier to let Kaken become a scar in his memory that didn't hurt until it was scraped raw again. Mina didn't mean to, but every time she said his name, Izuku felt the scar throb. And the strangest, ugliest thing was that beneath all the bitterness, all the shame, there was still a part of him that admired him. And that was the part he hated most, that even now, some small piece of him still believed Kaken was everything he'd never be. Then he caught it, the word echoing in his head. Kaken. Izuku blinked, his chest going tight. Why was he still calling him that? The name felt childish. He clenched his jaw, shoving the thought down hard. He didn't call him that anymore. Not out loud. Not even in his own head. Hitoshi arched a brow, stirring his drink lazily. So what, you want me to keep a stash of tissues in my pocket for you? Maybe hold your hand while you cry. Yes. Mina shot back without hesitation, jabbing her finger at him. You will be in charge of tissues and food. Because obviously my favorite food will help me feel better, duh. And the tissues are for the constant waterfall of tears that will happen for, like, 24 hours straight. Maybe longer. I'll probably need to take vacation time to recover from the heartbreak. So basically, we're your emotional bodyguards. Great. I'll make sure to bring popcorn. Izuku snorted into his sleeve. And you, Mina whipped around to point at him now, eyes narrowing dramatically. You're in charge of emotional support, Zuku. Because out of everyone at this table, you're the most in tune with your emotions. Izuku froze mid-breath. Which was honestly the biggest lie he'd ever heard in his life. If only she knew how much of a mess his emotions really were, coiled and knotted and shoved into corners he refused to touch. But he just gave her a weak smile, because correcting her would mean admitting way too much. And also, Mina added with a grin, you're a doctor. So if I, go crazy and rampage in pain or something, you can help me. Two birds, one Zuku. Hitoshi let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Wow. You've really thought this whole post-confession plan through. Should we start drawing up contracts? Mina stuck her tongue out at him. Izuku chuckled. Just let us know when you decide to tell him. We'll be here for you, they reassured. Izuku kicked the apartment door shut with his heel, juggling a box of leftovers in one hand and a strap of his shoulder bag in the other. The lingering scent of dessert from Mina still clung to him, the kind of indulgence he never would have chosen for himself. She had insisted he take it, claiming he would forget to eat otherwise. He had laughed at the time, but her words echoed in his mind as he entered his apartment. Deep down, he knew the truth, Mina didn't trust him to take care of himself. None of them did. He had laughed it off, but it stung. He had always wanted to be the one saving others, not the one needing saving. The fridge groaned when he opened it, nearly empty except for a few takeout boxes. He shoved tonight's meal onto the shelf and closed the door with more force than necessary. For a moment, he stood there, palm resting against the cool metal. He should have felt accomplished. He had everything he'd worked for, his degree, his residency, his practice. He was good, no, the best at what he did. People lived because of him. They walked out of his ER stitched up and safe. Yet, every time he let his mind quiet, a gnawing emptiness clawed at his chest. It felt like a part of him was missing, something he couldn't quite identify. He saved lives every day, but not in the way he had dreamed of since childhood. It was almost laughable spending years convincing himself he was happy, only to be reminded that it was all a facade. He had done everything right. He had succeeded. But it still felt like failure. Why did it feel like the life he was living belonged to someone else? Izuku dropped his bag on the table and slumped into the nearest chair, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his palms. He tried to smother the ache that was less physical and more constant, a quiet voice in his chest whispering the same thing it always had since he was 4 years old, hero. This life, this work, it was good. More than good. He saved people every day. They walked into his ER broken and bleeding, and he kept their lives from unraveling. He put them back together. Wasn't that what he had always wanted? To save people with a smile, just like All Might. But no matter how many times he reassured himself, the ache didn't fade. Being a surgeon wasn't the same as being a hero, not the kind he had dreamed of. Sometimes his patients thanked him, even calling him a lifesaver. But he knew the truth, he had done his job. The real work, the healing, the rehabilitation was theirs. They were their own heroes. He just provided them the chance. Maybe that should have been enough. Maybe it was selfish to want more. But deep down, he couldn't shake the yearning for something he felt he was never meant to have. He wasn't supposed to feel this way at 24, not after years of proving himself in another field, not after years of hearing the same message: you can't be a hero without a quirk. It was impossible. It had always been impossible. So why was he still asking himself what if? He scrubbed his hands over his face, exhaling hard. No. He couldn't go there. He couldn't spiral. That dream earlier had rattled him, that was all. It wasn't reality. He was fine. He was happy. He loved his work, he loved saving lives. He had to love it. Because what else was there? If quirks didn't exist, if the world was just humans, this would have been his path from the start. He would have been proud to be a doctor, proud to call it his dream. So why wasn't it enough now? Because of one dream. That had to be it. It wasn't a flaw in him, it wasn't discontent. Just a dream bleeding into waking hours. He could shove it back where it belonged. He'd done it for years. He could do it again. He needed something else to focus on. Something useful. His gaze drifted to the edge of his bag, slouched against the leg of the chair. Almost without thinking, he pulled it closer, flipped the flap open, and retrieved the folder stamped Todoroki, Shudo. Technically, Todoroki was still on his patient list. He hadn't requested a transfer yet. Izuku wouldn't know for sure until tomorrow or until Todoroki returned with his lab results. But for tonight, he was still Izuku's responsibility. He opened the file, scanning the notes he had scribbled earlier. Todoroki's case was complicated but not unsolvable. If he didn't want to use his fire, that was fine. Izuku could respect that, even if part of him wanted to shake Todoroki until he realized how incredible that power was. But at the end of the day, Izuku was his doctor. If Todoroki didn't want to use his quirk, then Izuku's job was to find another way. There are medications that could, no, side effects too strong, could interfere with what about, not viable for long-term, maybe a combination therapy, lower doses across categories, less impact on performance. He tapped the pen against the page, muttering under his breath as he skimmed possibilities. He would find a way to support the body that Todoroki had chosen for himself. Medications, treatment plans, something to stop the damage before it cost him more. Izuku's pen scratched across the notebook, filling the page with furious notes and half-legible diagrams. If Todoroki could use both sides of his quirk, if he would, it would change everything. For his body. For his work. For everyone depending on him. He scribbled for hours. When he finally set the pen down, his hand was cramped, and the clock on the wall read an hour he didn't want to process. Izuku leaned back in his chair, staring at the mess of ink in front of him. If Todoroki stayed his patient, he'd give him the safer plan. The compromise. But if he didn't, Izuku would still push him. One more time. To try. To use everything he had. Because Izuku knew what it was like to hold yourself back. To pretend he was fine with only part of himself when all he truly wanted was to feel whole. Izuku ran a hand through his curls, staring at the notebook sprawled across the table. His handwriting was a mess, his thoughts even worse. If he just used both, if he'd just let himself. Izuku broke off, noticing how hard he was pressing the pen into the paper, the ink blotting in thick, angry dots. He dropped it with a groan, palms pressing into his eyes. Todoroki's refusal to use his fire, it made sense. The look on his face when Izuku had pushed him, it all made sense. But it still twisted something in Izuku's chest. Because wasn't that what he'd done, too? Lived with only half of himself. Pretended he was fine with it. His whole life had been built around that half version. No quirk. Just Deku. Just feeling useless. He shoved back from the table, the chair screeching against the floor. DMN Kaken, the name slipped out before he even realized it. Izuku froze. He hadn't said that name out loud in years. It wasn't supposed to linger in his mind anymore. And yet it had fallen out as easily as breathing. Kaken. The name that belonged to a boy who had laughed at him until the world joined in. The boy who had pushed him down so hard that even now, at 24, Izuku still felt the echo of it. But Mina's voice wouldn't. Leave him alone. Cats. The friend. The blunt but dependable one. The one who'd comfort Mina, in his own brash way, if Kirishima ever broke her heart. Izuku pressed his hand to his mouth, as if he could shove the name back in. Because if Kaken really had become someone new, someone Mina trusted, his hand curled tighter over his mouth, breath shallow. Who the hell am I even supposed to be, he whispered. The shrill buzz of his phone nearly sent him out of his chair. It rattled across the table, vibrating against the open notebook until the pages quivered. The hospital's emergency line flashed bright on the screen. Izuku stared at it, pulse pounding in his ears. Then it rang again. Louder. He swallowed hard, throat tight, and reached for it. The hospital doors banged open with enough force to rattle the hinges, Izuku's shoes striking hard against the linoleum as he sprinted down the hall. His bag slapped against his hip, the strap digging into his shoulder, but he didn't slow. Couldn't. The nurse's voice still rang in his ear, frayed with panic. Dr. Midoriya, we need you. Open chest wound, massive BLD loss. Multiple casualties inbound. Civilians and heroes both. It's bad. It's really bad. That was all she'd managed before the line cut, drowned in static and shouting in the background. Izuku had never heard any of the nursing staff like that before. They were the calm ones. If she'd sounded shaken, then whatever had happened out there was bigger than anything he'd ever faced. Now his lungs burned as he flew past the triage wing, already bracing for the flood of stretchers. From the snippets he'd caught, Central wasn't the only hospital receiving patients. The attack, whatever it had been, was too widespread. Casualties were being scattered across the city, every ER stretched to capacity. Izuku's hands twitched against the air. The nurse hadn't been able to say which hero was hanging on for dear life, just a hero. That was all. Izuku had always told himself he treated them the same. Every life mattered equally. But still, something in him snapped taut whenever it was a hero. Maybe it was selfish. Maybe it was foolish. But he couldn't help it. Heroes save people every day. The least he could do was be their hero. Izuku's reflection had been a blur when he caught it in the hospital glass doors, a pale, hollow-eyed mess with dark crescents stamped beneath his eyes. No sleep. He hadn't even realized the night had gone until the shrill buzz of his phone snapped him out of Todoroki's case file. He'd gone too deep again. He always did, when it came to heroes. Something about them short-circuited the part of his brain that remembered he was only human. He couldn't help it. Todoroki, Mina, Mirio, any of them, it was like all the wiring inside of him sparked at once, all sense of reason fried away. So of course he'd stayed up until dawn. And now here he was, being hauled back into the hospital by an emergency call with no time to wash his face, no time to disguise the fact that he looked exhausted. If the nurses noticed, they didn't say a word. Izuku's lungs screamed by the time he rounded the corner, shoes skidding across the polished floor. He wasn't unfit, he kept himself lean, toned enough to handle the 12-hour shifts and the sprinting emergencies, but he wasn't built like the heroes whose bodies filled these halls tonight. He wasn't built for this kind of running. But none of that mattered. His legs burned, his chest ached, and still he pushed faster, until he was crashing through the doors of the OR wing, nurses already waiting with frantic hands. Vitals, he barked, shoving his bag at someone without looking. Another set of hands were already dragging him toward the scrub sink. Pulse faint, BLD pressure barely holding. He coded twice in the ambulance, "We got him back both times, damage." Izuku demanded, voice clipped, breath harsh. Soap foamed under his hands, the automatic faucet running too slow for his patience. Pierced lung, chest cavity exposed. Severe trauma across the sternum. Doctor, it looks, the nurse faltered, something breaking in her voice. It looks like the heart itself, ruptured. We've never seen anything like it. Izuku's head snapped up, eyes narrowing behind his mask. Ruptured, he repeated, too sharp. That wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. Then how the hell is there still a pulse? That's just it, sir. The nurse's voice was disbelieving. We don't know. They were wrapping him in sterile gowns now, tugging gloves over his hands, adjusting his mask. The world blurred. He barely registered the rest-shredded tissue in the chest wall, catastrophic hand injuries, BLD loss beyond reason before they were ushering him to the swinging double doors. Izuku's pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. The sterile light of the ore flooded over him, bleaching the room in white. The nurses parted around him, their eyes all fixed on the table in the center. Izuku forced his gaze there, and stopped cold. BLD. That was the first thing. It was everywhere, slick on the tiles, dripping off the edge of the table, soaking every scrap of fabric on the body in front of him. Too much. Way too much. Izuku had seen BLD before. He worked with it every day, but never like this. Never in sheets so thick it looked like the hero's suit had been made from it. He didn't understand how there was even a pulse. How anyone with that much BLD loss could still be clinging on. His feet carried him closer, slow, as if his body already knew something his mind wasn't ready to accept. From this vantage point, he could see the chest cavity open wide, the heart barely moving. He forced his gaze upward, knowing he had to focus. And that's when he saw it. Blonde hair, matted but still somehow defying gravity, clumped in sharp angles he recognized all too well. Izuku's breath caught. No. No, no, no. He stepped closer, every muscle in his body tensing the nearer he got. The torn mask, the familiar cut of a hero's suit beneath the chaos, it was him. Every bone in Izuku's body felt frozen. Kaken. The name echoed in his mind, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it over the beeps and hisses of the monitors. He hated that he recognized him instantly, that his body reacted before his mind caught up. Even under all that BLD, even with the oxygen mask obscuring his face, Izuku knew exactly who was on that table. And he couldn't move. Kaken. The name screamed in his mind, relentless and overwhelming. Izuku remained motionless, aware that the staff were looking at him, waiting for him to give the first order. But he couldn't. His throat felt tight, his chest heaved as if there wasn't enough air in the room. There were no words for this. Not for the turmoil inside him. His heart raced, drowning out the sounds of the machines. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He hated that he recognized that hair, that out of all the heroes who could have been brought in, it was him. Even with the BLD, even with his face hidden behind the mask, even reduced to something unrecognizable, Izuku knew. The torn mask, the black edges of his suit barely visible beneath the BLD, every detail struck him like a blow. And he hated that he couldn't look away. He was rooted to the floor, staring, while everything in him screamed to act. Adrenaline had surged through him when the call came in, but this was different. His veins felt like fire, his body overloaded. Lightheaded. Dizzy. What was happening? Izuku's eyes were locked on Katsuki's face, but there was nothing looking back at him. No glare, no scowl, just a silent, broken body on the table. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had finally lost his mind. There was no way this was Katsuki. Yet, he couldn't imagine hallucinating him like this. If his mind had conjured nightmares, it wouldn't have been this. Katsuki was fierce, everything Izuku both hated and admired, but he would never picture him like this. It had been years since he'd seen him, since their paths had diverged and Izuku had moved across an ocean to build a future. High school in America, early college credits, a fast-tracked medical career. In all that time, he had imagined what it would be like to see Kaken again. Sometimes he regretted even allowing the thought to exist, wishing he never had to see that face again. But never like this. Never on a table, never in such a state. The sight made his stomach churn. "Doctor, what do we do?" The nurse's voice broke through the tension, sharp and panicked. All eyes were on him. Izuku's throat tightened. His hands wouldn't respond. His body was frozen, his feet stuck to the floor. He understood now why it was discouraged to operate on someone you knew. How could he move when the person in front of him was so deeply ingrained in his life? He couldn't do it. He couldn't. The monitor screamed. A flatline. Izuku's heart stopped with it. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. His ears rang, blood rushing in his head, drowning out the world around him. The reality of the situation narrowed to that one piercing sound and the still chest on the table. Katsuki's chest. His stomach twisted. His body wanted to fold in on itself, to shut down. Every part of him screamed no, 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 as if repeating it could turn back time. This couldn't be real. Because if it was, then Kaken was gone. That thought was unbearable, and his mind faltered. Then, before he could think, his body surged forward. His feet moved on their own, propelling him toward the table. His hands trembled, but they moved, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not losing him. Move, move." He pressed down, blood slick under his gloves, shouting for the paddles. The machine was wheeled over, gel applied, the pads pressed to the scarred skin. Clear. The jolt surged through the body on the table, and Izuku felt it resonate within himself. For one terrible second, nothing. Beep. Beep. Izuku's arms trembled as they braced against the table. His throat hurt from how hard he swallowed. He couldn't breathe a sigh of relief, all he could do was force himself to work. After that, it became instinct. His fingers moved while his chest burned. He clamped, stitched, and suctioned, barking orders as though each word could bring Katsuki back from the brink. The team moved with him, metal flashing under the lights, blood still flooding but being held back by sheer will and training. Then, silence shattered by the alarm again. "Flatline, he's going, we're losing him." "Charge the paddles now, now," someone yelled, already fumbling with the machine. Izuku felt a tightness in his chest that hurt. His vision narrowed, and for a moment, he feared his knees would buckle. He hated the panic rising in his throat. This was just another patient, it had to be, that was the rule. But it wasn't. It never would be. It was Kaken. Loud, fierce, untouchable Kaken, the boy who had challenged him his whole life, the one he swore he hated, and Izuku couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Not like this. Not on his table. This wasn't Kaken. Kaken didn't give up. Izuku wanted to grab him by the shoulders, shake him awake, and shout at him the way Katsuki had shouted at him countless times before. "Stop giving up. You don't get to give up. Not you." The monitors blared louder. Izuku knew it was just his body failing in ways no one could control, but it still felt like betrayal. Like Kaken was slipping through his fingers on purpose. That thought alone made his stomach churn. Because never, not once in his life had Kaken truly lost. To Izuku, Katsuki had always been the embodiment of victory. Every race on the playground, every exam, every fight, Kaken came out on top. He didn't just win, he dominated. He burned so bright, so relentlessly, that Izuku had built half his childhood around chasing that light, convinced Kaken could never fall. So to see him here, flatlined, body slack, life slipping away, felt impossible. Wrong. Kaken didn't lose. Not ever. And yet here he was, and Izuku couldn't reconcile it. Couldn't fit the image of the boy who was always 2 steps ahead with the one lying still and silent on his table. He pressed his hand flat over Katsuki's sternum, blood soaking through the glove, and for a brief moment, he thought, "Please, don't make me fail you, not like this." His throat burned as the words tore through his mind, harsh and urgent. Don't you dare lose now. Don't you dare let me be the reason you lose. Because if Kaken lost here, on this table, under his hands, it wouldn't just be death. It would be Izuku's fault. The words slipped past his lips before he could stop them, a hoarse whisper meant for no one else in the room. Don't you dare lose now. Don't you dare let me be the reason you lose. The shock surged through the body on the table. Everyone held their breath. Beep. Beep. A pulse. Stabilize him. We're not done. Izuku's arms trembled as he forced himself forward again, jaw clenched tight. And he worked. Because he couldn't afford to think anymore. Thinking meant feeling, and if he let himself feel, he'd shut down. So he didn't. He shoved everything into a box, slammed the lid, and locked it. The face on the table wasn't Kaken. It wasn't anyone. It was just a patient. Just tissue, just BLD, just organs that needed fixing. His hands moved on autopilot. Clamp, stitch, suction. The words left his mouth without him realizing half of them, sharp orders echoing back to him from the team. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there, shoulders hunched, sweat beading under the gown. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the truth kept pounding against the walls he'd built. It's Kaken. It's Kaken. But he refused to let it in. If he did, he would freeze, and Kaken know, the patient would bleed out. So he didn't think. He didn't feel. He just worked. Izuku didn't know when it happened. One moment, his mind was filled with thoughts of Kaken, the name echoing in his head. The next, it faded away, buried deep within him. He had to detach himself. The person on the table wasn't Katsuki Bakugou, he was just a body, a set of vitals, a heart that had stopped. Izuku focused on his work, moving on autopilot as he stitched, clamped, sutured, and repaired what he could. His voice remained steady as he issued commands, even though his mind was a whirlwind of chaos. Time lost meaning as he labored over the heart and the damaged lung tissue, his hands trembling as he tried to piece together what had been broken. Eventually, his attention narrowed to the ruined hand. Deep down, he understood that no matter how careful he was, it wouldn't be the same. The damage was too severe, but he tried anyway. Throughout it all, he avoided looking at the ash-blonde hair, refusing to see the boy who had once challenged him. He was just a surgeon, and this was just a patient. That was the only way he could cope. When it was finally over, and the monitors stabilized, Izuku removed his gloves with shaking hands. His voice was hoarse from hours of giving instructions, and his body ached, but none of that mattered. Kaken wasn't out of danger. The real test was just beginning: intensive monitoring, oxygen support for days, and a series of scans. Ultimately, it would depend on Kaken's will to fight. Izuku couldn't stay for that part. He pushed through the swinging doors of the operating room, the sterile air of the hallway hitting him hard. He removed his mask, barely noticing the BLD smudge on his cheek. He walked quickly, with no destination in mind, just wanting to escape. His footsteps echoed too loudly, and his breath came in shallow gasps until he finally crouched in a corner of the empty corridor. He gripped his hair, trying to steady himself as everything crashed down around him. The BLD, the hair, the name he hadn't allowed himself to think about for years screamed in his mind. The image of Katsuki's fragile body lingered, the boy who had always been strong and unstoppable now lying on his table. Izuku felt a wave of nausea. He forced himself to breathe, trying to calm the panic rising within him, but it didn't work. For the first time in years, he felt like that quirkless kid again, small, weak, and utterly powerless. He wished he had a healing quirk, something that could fix what was broken. The thought of Katsuki not making it wouldn't leave him. It had almost happened. For a terrible moment, he had felt the flutter of life stilled. They had brought him back, but the image replayed in his mind. He had left Katsuki in there, surrounded by strangers who didn't know how important he was, how many people depended on him. The realization hit Izuku hard, and he knew he should be calling someone, telling them something, but he didn't know what to say. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming feelings, but it didn't help. The pressure in his chest grew heavier, and his body shook uncontrollably. "SHT," he muttered, his voice cracking. He struggled to breathe, and then it broke. He folded forward, forehead resting on his knees, and a raw sob escaped him, echoing in the empty hallway. He tried to stifle it, but it kept coming. He hadn't cried like this in years. He attempted to focus on his breathing, but all he could see was Katsuki on that table. All he could hear was the flatline. His stomach turned violently, and he stumbled into the nearest bathroom, barely making it to the sink before he retched. When it was over, he stood there, gasping for air, feeling like a mess. He splashed water on his face, but it didn't clear the haunting image from his mind. Kaken on the table, almost gone. Izuku gripped the sink tightly, trying to steady himself. It was overwhelming, but he had to keep going. He was allowed to feel this way, but he was a doctor, after all. Doctors didn't fall apart in bathrooms. He needed to get himself together. His thoughts drifted back to Katsuki, as if they had been waiting for the right moment. Izuku took a deep breath, his hands trembling so much that he almost dropped his phone when he pulled it from his pocket. His thumb hovered over the screen as he scrolled down until he found the name. Mom. He needed to hear her voice. And someone had to tell Mitsuki and Masaru. Had anyone called them yet? Or were they still at home, unaware that their son had been on Izuku's table, in critical condition? The thought twisted his stomach. No, if someone hadn't informed them yet, someone had to call them. He pressed the call button, his thumb shaking. The call connected on the first ring. Izuku. Finally remembered your poor mother. You do know phones work both ways, right? Inko teased lightly, a tone that usually made him smile. But Izuku's throat was already tightening. All he managed was a broken, "Mom," immediately, her tone shifted. Izuku. Sweetheart, what's wrong? Did something happen? Are you hurt? His chest tightened. He tried to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. Mom, please, Inko pressed, her voice tight with concern. You're worrying me. Tell me what happened. Are you okay? Izuku's breath hitched. He gripped the phone tightly, forcing the words out before he lost his nerve. It's Kaken, he rasped. He came in tonight. There was a villain attack. He was Mom, he was in bad shape. His heart stopped, his voice cracked, and he pressed a shaking fist to his mouth. We brought him back. He's alive, but there was a pause on the other end, then Inko gasped sharply. Oh my god. Oh my god, Izuku Katsuki. He's okay. Okay. Izuku let out something between a laugh and a sob. Barely. I don't even know how, but yeah. He's alive. For now. Oh, sweetheart, Inko whispered, her voice trembling. You saved him. Izuku shut his eyes, leaning back against the wall. His voice came out hoarse, almost hollow. He didn't feel like he had saved him, though. They still have to observe him. For a long time. It's going to be a long road, Mom. I don't know if the hospital contacted his parents yet. Everything's chaos here. I doubt anyone had time. So can you? Can you call them? Tell them to come. They'll need to sign paperwork and they should be here. His voice cracked, thick with desperation. Of course I will, Inko promised immediately. I'll call them right away. But Izuku, her voice softened, trembling, honey, are you okay? You sound. Izuku, you don't sound okay. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead to his knees. Silence filled the line. No, he wasn't okay. Not even close. What were the odds that the boy he'd spent years trying to bury, trying to hate, ended up on his table tonight? The last thing Izuku had felt toward him, hours ago, had been bitterness. And now Katsuki was clinging to life, and Izuku was the one who'd held his heart in his hands. The guilt churned in his stomach. He hadn't caused the villain attack. He hadn't hurt Katsuki. But it didn't matter. He still felt like the universe had handed him this responsibility as some kind of punishment. For resenting Katsuki. For never letting go. Izuku. Inko's voice pulled him back, fragile with worry. His throat burned. He forced himself to answer, barely above a whisper. No. I'm not. Izuku, sweetheart. You did everything you could. You saved him. She paused, swallowing hard. That's more than anyone could ask of you. His stomach twisted. No, it wasn't enough. It didn't feel like enough. Because even after everything, even after pulling Katsuki's heart back into rhythm, Izuku had walked out. Left him lying there, unconscious and vulnerable, surrounded by strangers. Strangers who didn't know him, didn't understand him, not the way Izuku did. What if he woke up and Izuku clenched his eyes shut? He couldn't listen to her. She didn't know. She couldn't know. He'd never told her about the bullying, never confessed what Katsuki had done to him. He hadn't wanted to ruin his image in anyone else's eyes. So how could she possibly understand why it felt so wrong, so gutting, to leave him like that? To feel like this. I have to go, Mom, Izuku cut in quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. He ran a hand through his curls, pacing the cramped bathroom tile. There are still patients, more surgeries, I don't have time. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth, forcing himself to keep talking before she could respond. Just, please call his parents. Tell them he's here, at Central. His voice cracked, the word catching in his throat. He couldn't say he's okay. Because he didn't know if that was true. Not when there were so many things that could still go wrong. So he swallowed the words back, leaving them unspoken. Just tell them, he finished weakly. Inko exhaled, sharp with worry. I will. Right away. But Izuku honey, please, take care of yourself too, I have to go, he repeated, harsher this time. He didn't wait for her reply. He ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket with trembling hands. For a long moment, he stood in the cramped bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, skin pale under the harsh fluorescent light. He barely recognized himself. His chest felt tight, and the buzzing in his ears made it hard to think. He braced his palms against the sink, trying to ground himself. But the guilt didn't let up, the memory of flatlines and BLD clinging to him. He didn't know how long he stayed there, frozen, until his legs finally carried him out on autopilot. The rest blurred. The hallways. The faces he passed. The chief's voice telling him to take a break, that he was done for now. Somehow, he ended up in the staff lounge. Somehow, he collapsed onto the couch. Izuku woke up in the staff lounge with a start, his neck stiff from the way he'd slumped against the arm of the couch. For a moment, he was disoriented, the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights above making it feel like he was still in the operating room. It took him a full minute to remember where he was. His chest tightened again as he scrubbed both hands over his face and reached for his phone on the table beside him. The screen lit up with the time, 2:04 p.m. His stomach dropped. The last time he'd checked, it had been barely past 7 in the morning. He'd been out for hours. He shot upright so fast he nearly lost his balance. His scrubs were stiff with dried BLD that wasn't his. His hands felt heavy and clumsy, as if they didn't belong to him. Panic told him he'd wasted too much time, that he should have been in an operating room, doing something. But then he remembered the chief's words before he'd been ordered out, go rest, Midoriya. You'll be more use to us later. He exhaled slowly, trying to believe it. His body felt like it had been wrung out, leaving only the ache of exhaustion and a dull throb in his temples. He sat back down on the edge of the couch, phone clutched in both hands, and forced himself to breathe. Izuku couldn't sit still anymore. The lounge felt too far away from where Katsuki was. His stomach twisted with every passing second. He'd already been gone from that room for hours. He shoved his phone into his pocket and stepped into the hallway. The first nurse he saw nearly jumped at how quickly he stopped her. Katsuki Bakugou, he blurted, his voice rough from hours of silence. What room is he in? The nurse blinked at him, probably thrown off by the urgency in his tone, but she checked her chart. Bakugou's in post-op recovery, ICU wing. Room you'll need clearance, I'm his surgeon, Izuku cut in, sharper than he intended. He swallowed, forcing his tone back down. He's my patient. I need to check on him. There was a pause, then a small nod. All right, doctor. ICU wing, end of the hall. He's stable, but still critical. That word stable let him breathe for the first time since waking up. Critical still twisted something deep inside his chest, but stable was enough to get his legs moving. The walk down the hall felt longer than any stretch he'd ever taken. Every step closer fed his mind worst-case scenarios. What if something went wrong? He shook his head hard, forcing himself forward. His palms were clammy again. The closer he got, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. When he reached the ICU doors, he stopped for just a moment to get his breathing under control. Then he pushed through. The ICU smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharper than anywhere else in the hospital. Machines hummed quietly in the background. Dr. Midoriya, the nurse on shift, greeted as soon as he stepped in. I was told you'd be coming by. He's stable, for now. Heart rhythm is irregular but holding. Oxygen levels are being maintained with support. We've set him on a sedation protocol to limit strain. Izuku nodded along, but the words blurred. Numbers and charts that usually grounded him barely registered. Because Katsuki was right there. Lying in the bed, pale under the harsh fluorescent light, wires trailing from his chest to the monitor, a mask strapped over his face, hand wrapped in bandages. He looked small. Izuku's throat tightened. The monitor beeped steadily, and the rise and fall of Katsuki's chest was faint but visible. Yet seeing him like this made Izuku's stomach twist. He dragged his eyes away, just for a second, to nod at the nurse as she finished her briefing. He couldn't even remember what she'd said. Thank you, he muttered. When she left, it was just him and Katsuki. The room felt too quiet. Izuku's legs carried him forward before he could stop himself, until he was standing right beside the bed. Close enough to hear the hiss of the ventilator. Close enough to see the bruising under the edge of the oxygen mask. Izuku's lips parted, then shut again. He thought about saying anything. You're going to be fine, Kaken. But the words died in his throat. Because that's not how it was supposed to go. Every version of this moment he'd ever pictured, every imaginary conversation with Katsuki was loud, with Katsuki yelling over him, calling him names, telling him to stop being pathetic. Not this. Not a one-sided conversation with someone who couldn't even glare at him back. He clenched his jaw, forcing the sting in his eyes back down. He didn't want this to be the first time he finally got the courage to say what he needed to say when Katsuki couldn't even respond. That wasn't right. But standing here, seeing him like this, it felt wrong to stay silent, too. His throat itched with everything he wanted to say. The anger, the guilt, the years of holding it all in. Why now? Why did it have to be now? Why did Katsuki have to end up here? Why was this the first time they'd been in the same room in years? And of all the places, of all the circumstances, it had to be here, in the ICU, with Katsuki hooked up to machines. Broken down to someone Izuku barely recognized. Why did it have to be here, where Izuku couldn't say anything he'd imagined saying for years? Where it wasn't fair to unload the truth onto someone who couldn't respond. That was how it was supposed to go. Not this. They'd had so many chances to cross paths again. So many chances for the universe to bring them back together. But no. It had to be like this. Izuku's chest twisted as he stared at the one person he thought he'd prepared himself for and realized he wasn't ready at all. And worse, he wondered. He wondered in ways he never let himself with other patients. Was Katsuki's consciousness even here? Was he asleep, or was his body fighting battles Izuku couldn't see? Was he dreaming? Having nightmares? Was his subconscious clawing to stay alive the way Izuku had always known him to fight, or was it just empty? Quiet. That thought made his stomach twist, because another question crept in: what if Katsuki wasn't fighting? What if for the first time in his entire life he'd just stopped? It didn't feel possible. Katsuki Bakugou didn't quit. He was the embodiment of forward, of never giving in, of refusing to lose no matter the cost. Izuku had built his whole childhood around that fact. But now, standing here with the monitors ticking and the ventilator hissing, he couldn't shake the fear that maybe this was the exception. Maybe the body lying here was proof that even Katsuki Bakugou could let go. What if Katsuki was just done? What if he'd decided there was nothing left worth fighting for? Izuku's hands curled into fists at his sides, trembling against the weight of it. No. No, that wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the doubt still gnawed at his chest until it hurt to breathe, until every second of silence in that room felt like a verdict. The questions crowded his chest until he felt like he couldn't breathe. He'd never wondered this before with any other ICU patient, never cared to. But with Katsuki, the thought of him being in pain, trapped in his own body, alone with it was too much. It was unbearable. Izuku took a look at him. At the bandages, the tubes, the blonde spikes of hair that somehow still stood up despite everything. Then he turned away. He couldn't do this. He couldn't walk in here every day and pretend he was just another patient. He couldn't be the one in charge of this case when every part of him wanted to scream, to shake Katsuki awake, to demand he yell back at him. Someone else would have to handle it. Izuku stepped out of the room, shutting the door quietly behind him, his chest tight. For the first time in his career, he felt like a coward. But staying in there. Izuku walked the halls with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, head down, eyes glued to the sterile floor tiles like they had all the answers he couldn't find. Every step toward the chief's office felt heavier than the last. Coward. The word stuck to him. If Katsuki ever found out, if he woke up and heard that Izuku couldn't even stay in the same room as him, he'd never let him live it down. He'd call him every insult in the book. Spineless. Useless. Pathetic. Izuku could practically hear his voice already. And he wouldn't even be wrong. It was pathetic that after everything, after saving him on the table, Izuku couldn't stomach the sight of him. This was someone he'd spent an entire life knowing. Someone who'd been burned into his mind since childhood, someone he thought he'd never see again. And now here he was, and Izuku was running away. He hated himself for it. But his feet still carried him down the hall. Step after step, until the chief's office door loomed ahead. The whole way, the word echoed in his skull like a curse: coward. Izuku had already made his decision. Final. He'd tell the chief straight he couldn't take this case. He wouldn't go into detail. He'd just say what mattered. He knew the patient, and he wasn't going to have a clear head. And no hospital wanted a surgeon blinded by bias. That was it. He'd said what he needed to say. He wasn't Katsuki's doctor anymore. The meeting was brief. The chief appeared puzzled. Izuku had built a reputation at Central for never shying away from challenging cases. But this time, something in Izuku's expression must have indicated that it wasn't merely about being too close. The chief didn't press further. He simply nodded and mentioned he would reassign the case, adding, "You're the best surgeon we have, Midoriya." Izuku swallowed hard and replied, "Then assign someone who's the best without a fogged head." The chief studied him for a moment, as if he sensed there was more Izuku wasn't sharing. Ultimately, he agreed. As Izuku exited the office, he thought he would feel relieved. He hoped that letting go of the case would lift the weight pressing down on him. Instead, he felt worse. His chest was heavy with guilt, as if he had abandoned someone who mattered, someone he still cared about, more than he wanted to admit. The truth was, he didn't even know who Katsuki was anymore. The boy who had sneered at him in middle school, who had made every day feel like a struggle, that wasn't the man on the operating table. At least, Izuku didn't think it was. He didn't want to know. Because if Katsuki had changed, then that meant Izuku had changed too. He wasn't useless or spineless anymore. He wasn't the same boy who could barely stutter out a full sentence without breaking into a sweat. He wasn't extroverted, but he could hold his own now. Start a conversation. End 1. Walk into a room without feeling small. He was better. Stronger. Yet, standing in that hallway, leaving the office, he had never felt so small. Izuku had to ask himself what had really changed. Here he was, still feeling like a coward. All these years later, and he still couldn't face Katsuki Bakugou without that same deep-seated fear. Katsuki had changed, but had Izuku. His feet carried him down the hall on autopilot, this time not toward the ore but toward his rounds. The chief had told him to go home and rest, but Izuku brushed it off. He was already there. What was the point? He might as well finish his shift. He had gotten more sleep than anyone else working at that moment. And, well, it was him. They didn't enforce the same rules on Izuku as they did on everyone else. The chief hadn't argued, only advised him to stay clear of the ER surgeries for now, which Izuku appreciated. That's where he was headed. Mirio needed to be discharged today. Izuku had completely forgotten until just then. His stomach twisted at the thought. He couldn't help one hero. He couldn't help Katsuki. But he could help Mirio. That counted for something. And later, Todoroki. Right, Todoroki. Izuku had left his bag somewhere, the one stuffed with all the files and notes he'd been working on for Todoroki's case. He needed to find it soon. Imaging was supposed to be scheduled for that day, if the nurse had managed to slot him in. Izuku wasn't sure what time. It didn't matter. What mattered was that when he checked the patient list for the day, Todoroki's name was still there. He hadn't switched doctors. Izuku tried to take comfort in that. Todoroki hadn't switched yet. Mirio was stable and ready to leave. Two heroes he could help. Izuku pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling a breath of fresh air wash over him. Mirio radiated positivity. "Mirio," Izuku greeted, soft but steady. "How are you feeling?" He grabbed the chart at the foot of the bed, flipping it open automatically. Mirio grinned as usual. "Never better," he said, giving a thumbs up. His voice was bright, but something in his eyes didn't match. He lowered the chart a little, watching him. "You sure?" Mirio began, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "I feel like I should have been out there. During the attack. You know. If I wasn't here, in this state," his smile faltered. "I could have been out there helping. Fewer people would have been hurt. Maybe even saved." Izuku blinked, momentarily confused before it clicked. His stomach tightened. "Mirio," he said slowly. But Mirio shrugged, forcing another small smile. "I'm the number one hero, right? Saving people is supposed to be what I do. And when it mattered the most, I wasn't there." Izuku closed the chart. He needed a moment to think, to let Mirio's words sink in. Because he wasn't wrong. If the number one hero had been there, it would have made a difference. Mirio had saved more people than anyone. It wasn't far-fetched to believe fewer casualties would have occurred. But at the same time Izuku knew better. He understood that if the number one hero was down, if he pushed himself when his body wasn't ready, then no one would be saved in the long run. Izuku took a slow breath. I get it, it's tough. Knowing people got hurt, and you couldn't do anything. I understand that feeling. His throat tightened for a moment, his mind flashing against his will to a certain blonde on an operating table, but he pressed on. But you're injured right now. And if you'd gone out there like this, he paused, meeting Mirio's gaze. What if that was your last time saving people? What if pushing your body too far meant you couldn't save anyone ever again? Mirio's expression shifted, the frown softening. Yeah, maybe you missed one chance, Izuku continued. But if you get better, if you recover, then you'll have 100 more chances to save people. And that's worth more than forcing yourself once and burning out for good. The room fell silent, just the beep of the monitor filling the space. Mirio stared at him, and then the smallest smile tugged at his face. You're right, he admitted, a little sheepishly. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good. Then let's focus on getting you discharged and into recovery. Because the world still needs its number one hero. Izuku pulled up the chair beside Mirio's bed, flipping open the file again. His voice shifted into that practiced, professional tone. Okay, so no straining. We've already gone over this, but I'll remind you again. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. You can resume hero work, but if anything feels off, pain, shortness of breath, fatigue, you need to stop immediately and cool down. Don't push through it. Understood. Mirio gave him a quick salute, all smiles. Yes, I got it. No pressure. Izuku frowned, closing the folder with a quiet snap. I'm serious, Mirio. Please don't put too much strain on yourself. You'll be due back for follow-up tests. We need to keep monitoring your other organs, just to be safe. Mirio chuckled lightly. Hey, Doc, don't worry. I'll be okay. I won't put too much pressure on myself, I promise. I'll keep up with the checkups and take all the medication you prescribed. Izuku's shoulders eased slightly. Good. Make sure you go pick it up before you leave. He glanced up from the notes. Is someone coming to get you? Yeah, I've got a friend picking me up later, Mirio nodded. Perfect. Once they're here, you'll be clear to go home. Izuku stood, slipping the folder back onto the chart rack. Well, Mirio, I hope not to see you too soon. He managed a small smile. But I will see you for those checkups, okay? Okay, Mirio agreed easily. Izuku turned toward the door. Be safe. Don't go too hard again. Hey, Doc, Mirio called after him, grinning. Do you realize you just called me Mirio? Izuku froze mid-step, his brain stalling. He turned back, red creeping up his ears. That was slip of the tongue, I like it, Mirio interrupted with a grin. Please don't go back to calling me Mr. Togata. I mean, I'd consider us friends now, wouldn't you? After everything. Izuku blinked at him, floored. Friends. With the number one hero. That wasn't something you heard every day. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Mirio leaned forward, his tone softer but steady. I trust you with everything, you know that, right? Izuku flushed, waving a hand. Oh okay, you don't have to be so dramatic. No, I mean it, Mirio said firmly, though his smile never wavered. I trust you. Any other doctor probably would have spread the news about the number one hero being sick. But you didn't. You haven't breathed a word. And honestly, I love the nurses here too, they've kept it quiet. Izuku blinked, surprised. He hadn't thought about it that way. It was true, any nurse could have slipped. But it was a small, carefully chosen team who even knew Mirio was here, and none of them had let it leak. That thought settled. He nodded slowly. Of course. It's not something for the public. It's your life. Your privacy. Mirio's grin widened. Exactly. That's why I trust you. Izuku hesitated, then finally allowed himself a tiny smile back. Okay, Mirio. Mirio tilted his head with that big grin of his. And since we're friends now, that means we can hang out outside the hospital, right? Izuku blinked, caught off guard again. Do you even have time to hang out? Of course I do, Mirio said without missing a beat. I have to make time for everyone. My fans, the people I save, my friends, my family, everybody deserves a little bit of my time. Izuku huffed under his breath, shaking his head. You're gonna stretch yourself thin at that rate. Mirio laughed, that booming sound filling the room. Then I guess I'll just have to eat twice as much to keep up with it. Izuku cracked a smile but shook his head again. Alright, Mirio. Take care of yourself. I'll check on you at your follow-ups. Got it, Doc, Mirio said, still smiling. Don't forget we're friends now. Izuku's ears burned at that, so he quickly nodded, mumbled a quiet goodbye, and slipped out of the room. As Izuku stepped out of Mirio's room, his heart raced with excitement. He had just casually promised to hang out with the #1 hero. Like that was normal. Like he hadn't spent his whole childhood dreaming of even meeting a pro. And now here he was, joking around with Togata Mirio like they were friends. Friends. The word still didn't feel real. He shook his head hard, trying to clear it as he made his way down the hall. He needed to focus. He still had rounds to do. People waiting. He couldn't get stuck replaying Mirio's grin in his head like some starstruck kid. Izuku ducked into the small alcove where he usually checked his list, pulling up the patient log on the tablet. Names scrolled down in neat lines, his eyes caught on one in particular, short, sharp, no last name attached. His stomach tightened. That name alone set off alarms, though no one knew if it was real. Probably wasn't. Probably just another alias scribbled down because he refused to give anything else. This patient was complicated. The hospital hadn't even wanted to admit him the first time, saying someone like that didn't belong here, not with his record. But Izuku had insisted. Pushed. Because whatever he'd done outside those doors, inside them he was still a patient. Still human. Izuku could still remember the first night. The way the man had stared at him, half daring him to help, and the other half expecting him to walk away like everyone else. And Izuku hadn't. He'd stitched, treated, monitored. The internal damage. The lungs, the heart stress, the way his body seemed to be struggling that he could at least manage. Keep him alive. For now. Even so, the man never hid what he thought. He hated heroes. Said they were parasites in costumes, playing gods. It had been strange, hearing it said so bluntly. Izuku dragged his thumb down the screen, forcing his mind off it. He would see him next, do the discharge, go through the motions. Izuku was still staring at the name on the list, thumb hovering above the screen, when the sound hit him. Shoes pounding. Shouts ricocheting down the hall. He looked up just in time to see a group of nurses rushing past, their scrubs a blur of teal and white. One of them nearly clipped his shoulder, muttering a rushed, "Sorry, doctor," but Izuku barely heard it. His ears snagged on something else. "It's the pro-hero cardiac arrest, he's flatlining again, call Dr. Saito, he's assigned," the words blurred, but his brain filled in the gaps instantly. His stomach dropped. Kaken. For one breathless second, Izuku couldn't move. Couldn't think. He just sat there, heartbeat pounding against his ribs hard enough to drown everything else out. He knew this would happen. He'd known. Post-op patients like Katsuki were fragile, unpredictable. Complications weren't just possible, they were expected. And yet he'd left. He'd walked out because he couldn't stand to look at him. And now he wasn't his doctor anymore. Which should have felt like relief. But the words, not his doctor, turned sick in his mouth, because suddenly that meant, not allowed in there, not allowed to touch him, not allowed to save him. His whole body jolted before his brain caught up. His feet were moving, sprinting in the same direction as the nurses, his ID badge bouncing against his chest. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had no patients in ICU that day, but none of that mattered. Not when the image of Katsuki's chest stuttering and then stilling filled his mind. The sound of those words flatlining again echoed inside his ears like a siren. Chapter 4, The silence between heartbeats. For a moment, Izuku felt as if his own heart had stopped. The sharp, shrill alarm echoed in his mind, leaving him with a single, haunting thought. His feet had led him here before he could think to stop them. He should have stayed away, should have let Dr. Saito handle it. That was the rule, the whole point of stepping back. So why had he followed the nurses? Why had he let his legs carry him to the ICU doors, drawn like a moth to a flame? Now, he couldn't move. He was rooted to the floor, palms sweaty, every nerve ending braced for what lay beyond those double doors. He already knew what awaited him on the other side. He could feel it in his bones, just as he recognized the shape of that hair, the sound of that voice, the weight of that name. Kaken. The thought alone made his knees lock tighter. Every alarm blaring in that room felt like it was meant for him too. This was different from the paralysis he had felt in the ore when he first saw the chaos and realized who it belonged to. Back then, adrenaline had pushed him forward, but now he was frozen, as if his body understood what his mind refused to admit: he didn't belong there anymore. If he had stayed, if he had fought through the shame and kept the case, this wouldn't be happening. He would have checked on Katsuki himself. He would have caught the signs earlier, he told himself, even if it was irrational. He could have prevented this spiral. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Complications like this were inevitable, they came with the territory. Katsuki's heart had been held together with stitches and luck, no surgeon could promise stability. Izuku had told patients' families that 100 times before. Yet, the logic didn't stop the thought from gnawing at him. If it had been him, if he had stayed, and wasn't this the exact reason he had stepped back? Because Katsuki wasn't supposed to be different. Because Izuku wasn't supposed to feel like this. Because he wasn't supposed to second-guess every step, to wonder if he'd done enough, to hesitate when hesitation could mean life or death. The whole point had been to keep his head clear. So why did it feel like the moment he handed the case away, he'd made it worse? The distance between them was supposed to help. Ironically, there had been so much distance between them for years. They hadn't spoken in ages. They weren't close anymore. But Katsuki's name still twisted something inside him so violently that Izuku barely recognized himself anymore. How could he explain that to anyone when he couldn't even explain it to himself? 7 years had passed, filled with silence. He had gone to America, immersing himself in textbooks, labs, sleepless nights, and clinical rotations, anything to keep moving forward. Katsuki had stayed behind, becoming the explosive, unstoppable force he was known for, while Izuku only caught glimpses of him through headlines or TV screens. If he wanted details, he got them secondhand, through the way Mina's voice brightened when she talked about him. That was the only insight Izuku ever had. But even that had been enough. Enough for Izuku to feel the same old electricity coil in his chest, enough to remind him that Katsuki was still out there, still shining bright while Izuku chased shadows. And now, after all that distance, after all that silence, it was still the same. The mere presence of Katsuki alive, fighting, still stopped Izuku in his tracks. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Being far from him had been blinding, like staring too long at the sun until his vision blurred. Being close was the same, overwhelming, leaving him with nothing but the shape of Katsuki imprinted in his mind. Too far, too close, it didn't matter. The result was the same. Katsuki Bakugou was still the one thing that unraveled him, and Izuku didn't know how to live with that truth. How could he still have this hold over him? How could someone he had sworn to hate, someone he had spent years resenting, still do this to him? Still reduce him to nothing? He tried to convince himself it wasn't Katsuki. It was the circumstance, the monitors, the relentless alarms signaling that he was slipping away. The nurses shouted where was Dr. Saito, bring the paddles, hurry, but their voices felt distant, muffled, as if they were shouting through glass. His mind barely processed the words. He wasn't moving. He wasn't helping. He was frozen. And maybe that was why he was unraveling. Not because Katsuki still had power over him, but because for the first time, he didn't. Katsuki wasn't the loudest voice in the room, wasn't the force that bent everything around him. He was still. Weak in a way Izuku had never seen before. Katsuki had no power right now. And that god, that terrified Izuku more than anything. Because his whole life, Katsuki had been the standard. The unreachable ideal. The one thing Izuku could never catch or match, no matter how hard he tried. He hated him for it. He adored him for it. He hated that he adored him and loved that he hated him, because at least it meant he still felt. Katsuki was everything Izuku wanted to be, confident and untouchable. Everything Izuku lacked, Katsuki carried effortlessly. And now he was TRPPD of it all. Izuku didn't know who he was looking at. The contradictions knotted tighter in his chest. He hated him. He admired him. He resented him. He desired to be him. He couldn't separate one feeling from the other anymore. And standing there, paralyzed, with the one person who had defined his entire existence slipping away in the next room, Izuku thought he might actually break from the weight of it. He needed to move. He needed to be himself again, the surgeon who knew what to do, the one who didn't freeze, who didn't hesitate. He knew how to work under pressure. He knew how to fight for a patient. He knew how to save. But not with Katsuki. Every command, every reflex, every ounce of training was trapped under the avalanche of everything else. Move, he told himself. Just move. But his feet stayed planted to the floor. It felt overwhelming, a mix of emotions crashing over him like waves. His lungs struggled for air, and his chest felt constricted, as if bound by iron bands. He couldn't identify what was suffocating him, guilt, fear, hate, or love. They were all tangled together, making it impossible to separate one from the others. It was too much. This wasn't like the operating room. In the OR, he had acted instinctively, driven by training and the urgency of the moment. Katsuki's life had been slipping away, and there had been no time for hesitation. But now, the same heart was failing just beyond him, and everything felt different. He didn't understand why he was frozen, unable to move forward when he should have been able to rush through those doors and fight for Katsuki again. His thoughts raced chaotically, pressing against his skull and suffocating him from within. He felt a whirlwind of emotions toward Katsuki, hate, resentment, admiration, and a desperate urge to wake him up. He wanted to rush into the ICU and bring him back, but he felt paralyzed. Izuku choked on a breath, his throat tightening under the weight of it all. His stomach twisted painfully, and he feared his legs would give out if he tried to move. He felt useless, like the Deku he had always been, frozen in place while Katsuki slipped away. He urged himself to move, but the truth hit him hard, he didn't know if he wanted to. Moving meant confronting his feelings, admitting the complexity of his emotions toward Katsuki. It meant making a choice he couldn't bear to face. The alarm blared louder, and the frantic calls of the nurses pierced through his thoughts. They were calling for the paddles again, and the urgency of the moment crashed over him. Katsuki's heart had been still for almost a minute, and Izuku remained rooted in place, overwhelmed by everything except the one thing that mattered, moving. Izuku's chest heaved with each breath, and his mother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that he had saved Katsuki once. But standing there, paralyzed, he felt anything but heroic. He was letting everyone down, unable to act when it mattered most. Then, the monitor went flat, a single, piercing note filling the ICU. For a moment, Izuku felt as if it was his own heart that had stopped. The world around him stilled, and he was engulfed in silence. But then, a voice broke through the haze. "Move, nerd." It was Katsuki's voice, soft yet unmistakable, cutting through the chaos. Izuku froze, grappling with disbelief. He must be imagining it, the stress and guilt playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it again, "Move." The command jolted him into action. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the ICU doors. He burst through, his gloves snapping tighter as he approached the bed. Katsuki lay still, too still, as nurses hurried around, preparing to intervene. But none of it mattered if Katsuki's chest didn't rise and fall. Izuku's hands shook, but he knew he couldn't perform standard CPR, it wouldn't work. He needed to act differently. "Scalpel," he called, his voice hoarse. The nurse hesitated but quickly handed it over. He didn't have time to think, he sliced through the sutures he had sewn not long ago, pulling the wound open with hands that steadied themselves despite his racing heart. And then he saw it, Katsuki's heart. Izuku's vision narrowed, every sound fading except for the relentless flatline. He felt a surge of nausea but forced himself to focus. His hands moved instinctively, wrapping around the muscle, squeezing rhythmically, willing it to remember how to beat. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, trying to lend rhythm to the body beneath him. "Come on, Kaken," he urged, his voice breaking. "Don't you dare give up on me now." He continued his efforts, pushing with desperation, love, and guilt all bleeding through his gloves into that fragile muscle. "Kaken, you hear me? You don't lose." The nurse's voice cut through the blur. Paddles charged, "Do it." Izuku snapped, still compressing. He barely pulled his hand back in time. Clear. The jolt surged through the body on the table, Katsuki's chest arching under the shock. Izuku flinched, his whole body jerking with the force of it. For 1 second nothing. Flat. "Kaken," his voice cracked on the name. "No, no, no," his hand dove back in. Pump. 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 His breath broke into sobs he couldn't hold back. Every squeeze was a plea, every push a scream his chest couldn't voice. "You stubborn bastard," he whispered through tears. "That's not you. You don't quit. You fight. So fight. With me. Right now fight, Kaken." Clear. The second shock ripped through the air. Silence. Beep. Izuku froze, breath caught in his throat. Beep. Beep. The monitor stuttered, then steadied into a rhythm. Relief hit him hard, dragging a sob out of his chest. His hand still cradled Katsuki's heart, trembling, feeling the faint flutter against his palm. It was weak, but it was alive. His head dropped, forehead almost hitting the edge of the table. "You stubborn bastard," he whispered again, voice cracking. "That's more like you." Izuku strpped his gloves off with shaking hands, the snap of the LTX loud in the quiet that followed. His scrubs were ruined BLD up to his elbows, streaks across his chest where he'd leaned too close. He barely felt it. His body moved on autopilot, scrubbing down at the sink, water running pink down the drain. His reflection in the steel panel above the faucet looked worse than the mess on his clothes. Wide eyes. Damp curls plastered to his forehead. He didn't even look like himself. Behind him, nurses murmured, jotting notes, recording times, cataloging doses, shocks, compressions. He tuned it all out. His ears still rang with that flatline. His palms still remembered the feel of Kaken's heart. The door slammed open. "What do you think you're doing?" Izuku froze. He didn't need to turn to know the voice. Dr. Saito. The physician of record. The one assigned after Izuku had stepped away. Izuku turned anyway, jaw tight. Saito stood just inside the threshold, mask dangling around his neck, eyes hard. "That was my patient," Saito said sharply. "Your patient was dying," Izuku snapped back. His voice cracked through the room. Heads turned. Sato's glare didn't waver. "I was with another crash. ICU isn't a one-man show. You don't just abandon one code for another." Izuku's chest heaved. Rage built under his ribs. "And what, you thought leaving this one to flatline was better?" His hands shook at his sides. "He was gone. He was gone, and you weren't here. You don't get to storm in and cut open a chest that isn't yours." Sato's voice rose, echoing off the tile. "Protocol exists for a reason. You compromised the case. You compromised me." Something twisted in Izuku's chest. He almost said it almost. Spat the truth in Sato's face. "Do you even know who that was?" But he bit it down hard. Instead, all he managed was, "If I hadn't stepped in, you wouldn't have a case left to compromise." The silence after that was thick. Nurses exchanged quick glances, some shifting uncomfortably. The air reeked of BLD and antiseptic and tension. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Saito said finally, voice low but shaking with bitterness. "The prodigy. Midoriya Izuku. Youngest surgeon on staff. Everyone falling over themselves to praise you, calling you the best." His lip curled. "Some of us actually had to work for it. Years of study. Decades of experience. And you think just because you got fast-tracked, just because you got here sooner, you know everything." Izuku's jaw clenched. His fists tightened at his sides. He tried to swallow it down. But the words ripped out of him anyway. "What I know is that your patient was dying." His voice shook the air, loud enough to make every nurse freeze. "Your patient was gone. And I brought him back. Because that's my job. Because I'm a doctor." His chest heaved with rage. "You expect me to stand outside those doors, hear the silence of a flatline, hear the silence of a hero dying, because you have more years under your belt?" Sato's face twisted. "You're misinterpreting my words." "I'm not," Izuku spat. "You want to talk about authority. About protocol. Fine. Let's talk about how you weren't even here." His voice cracked, rising with the heat in his chest. "You weren't here. You left him." "I didn't leave him." Saito snapped, fury bleeding through now. "I was with another patient. A patient coding doesn't erase the one in front of me. Don't you dare say I didn't care." Izuku stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You don't care. He flatlined. He was gone. And I did my job, I brought him back. Before I even knew what I was dealing with. And don't you dare stand there and tell me I shouldn't have. Don't you dare." "It's still not protocol," Saito threw back, but his voice faltered. Izuku's lips curled into something colder than a smile. "Protocol. You should be thankful it was me who walked through those doors. Because I'm the best cardiac surgeon in this hospital. The best in Japan. And I knew what to do when you didn't. You don't specialize in cardiac. You never have. You would have watched him die because you didn't know where to start." The room was silent. Nurses stiff as statues, eyes flicking between them. Izuku's voice didn't waver. "I didn't need your permission. I didn't need your authority. I did what had to be done, I saved him. And I'd do it again. Over and over. Because clearly you couldn't." His chest rose and fell, every syllable filled with tension. "As a doctor. As a surgeon. As anything." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Enough." The chief's voice cut through the tension as he stood in the doorway. "Midoriya. Saito. My office. Now." The walk back to the chief's office felt unbearable. It was too quiet, the silence pressing on Izuku's chest as he walked, each step echoing in his ears. It wasn't a long walk, just a few halls and an elevator ride, but it felt like an eternity. Sato's glare burned into him, and Izuku kept his eyes straight ahead, jaw clenched, fists buried deep in his pockets to hide his trembling hands. When they finally reached the office, the door closed behind them with a heavy click. The chief wasted no time. He gestured for them to sit, his expression unreadable, voice steady in a way that made the weight of the situation worse. What I just witnessed was unacceptable. His eyes flicked between Izuku and Saito, sharp as scalpels. Two senior surgeons shouting at each other in front of an entire nursing staff. If I'd had patients in that room, this conversation would be taking place in front of the board, not in my office. Izuku's throat felt dry. And worse, the chief continued, his words clipped, you did this in front of one of the most critical patients this hospital has seen in years. A patient whose life is still hanging by a thread. The silence that followed was suffocating again. Izuku's stomach twisted. A patient whose life is still hanging by a thread that was Kaken. He had stood there arguing instead of keeping his composure. The chief's gaze was sharp and unyielding. You both let your tempers take over. You crossed a line. I don't care if it was stress or the heat of the moment. That doesn't excuse it. His voice dropped, quiet but heavy. We don't do that here. Not in this hospital. Not in front of staff. And especially not in front of a patient whose life is as fragile as this one's. Izuku swallowed hard, guilt burning under his skin. He could still hear his own voice from earlier, louder than it had ever been in this building. I'm the best cardiac surgeon in this hospital. The words rang in his ears, ugly and arrogant. He hated himself for it. He hated that it had been Katsuki of all people that had brought that side of him out. Something had snapped, and he couldn't explain why. The chief let the silence stretch before continuing. You're both leaders in your own right. Staff watch you. They follow your example. What they saw today was chaos, not leadership. If either of you ever repeat what happened in that ICU, I'll have no choice but to take it higher. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir, Izuku said immediately. Yes, sir, Saito echoed, bitterness evident in his tone. The reprimand was equal, but Izuku felt it sting deeply. He had lost control, lost his composure. And for what? For Kaken. Always for Kaken. Dr. Saito, wait outside, the chief ordered. Saito bristled but obeyed, slipping out and shutting the door behind him with a bit too much force. Izuku was left alone in the office, the silence swallowing him whole. The chief leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. For a moment, he studied Izuku with that unreadable gaze that made even senior surgeons feel like residents again. I don't know where to begin, he said at last, voice low. Because that wasn't you back there, Midoriya. Izuku's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He couldn't find words. The chief's gaze didn't waver. You've always been the one I could trust to stay calm under pressure. To put ego aside and focus on the work. You've built a reputation on that. And yet, his jaw tightened slightly. What I saw in that room was not composure. It was, personal. Izuku's chest squeezed. He looked down, knuckles white on the arms of his chair. Personal. The word cut right to the bone. The chief's voice softened. I don't need to know the details. Whoever that patient is to you, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you cannot afford to lose yourself like that again. Not here. Not in this hospital. Izuku's pulse thudded in his ears. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that Katsuki Bakugou wasn't just another patient. But the words died in his throat. The chief was right. He had lost himself so many times today that he felt like he was losing his mind. He had frozen, cried, and acted completely out of character more times than he ever had in his life. Each of those moments had nearly cost Kaken his life. But this was more than personal. This was Kaken. The chief leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. His voice was quieter now, but sharper for it. Do you know this patient, Midoriya? Izuku's breath hitched. It was a strange question. Of course the chief knew he knew the patient. It was the reason he had taken a step down. Did he know the patient? The answer should have been simple yes or no, but it wasn't. Not when it came to Katsuki. Because Izuku had known him since they were kids. Their families had been close, and they had grown up side by side in the same neighborhood. It had seemed like fate that they would be best friends. He remembered those days, playing heroes before they had quirks. Katsuki had always been loud and explosive, even before his quirk manifested. No one knew Katsuki better than Izuku back then, and no one knew Izuku better than Katsuki. And then Katsuki turned 5, a couple of months older, and his quirk had come to life. Izuku followed, waiting, and then his own moment never came. Just like that, the shift began. Katsuki didn't want to play as much anymore. He couldn't play rough with Izuku without hurting him. So, he played with the other kids instead, and Izuku, of course, followed. Always followed. Year after year, Katsuki slipped further away until he was gone. In his place stood someone Izuku barely recognized. Someone who hurt anyone who didn't meet his impossible standards, who sneered at weakness, who expressed cruelty effortlessly. Middle school had been the worst. That's when the hurtful words started, things that cut deeper than any physical blow. That was the Katsuki he learned to know. Cruel. Cold. Arrogant. The kind of person who made Izuku feel small and unworthy. And then Izuku left. He left Japan. He left everything. For 7 years, he didn't look back, not until he returned at 20 to start his residency. By then, Katsuki was just a name on the TV, a voice in Mina's stories, painting a new picture of version Izuku didn't recognize. A Katsuki who fought alongside heroes, saved lives, got along with people, and even formed genuine friendships. So when the chief asked if he knew this patient, Izuku felt a hollow ache in his chest. Because the truth was complicated. Yes, he knew him. He knew him better than anyone. He knew every version of him: childhood friend, cruel stranger, untouchable hero. And yet, he didn't know him at all. Not anymore. Izuku swallowed hard, throat raw, but forced himself to respond. I told you. I knew him. From before. That's why I stepped down. It came out vague, too vague, and he knew it. The words felt insubstantial, nothing that explained the storm tearing him apart from the inside. But he couldn't give the real answer. He couldn't say Katsuki. He couldn't even shape the syllables here. The chief watched him for a long moment, eyes unreadable, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. The only reason I'm asking again, Midoriya, is because I want to confirm something. Izuku's chest tightened. Confirm what? What could possibly need confirming when everything already felt painfully obvious to him? The chief continued, calm but firm, his words cutting clean. This patient must be very close to you. Closer than you let on. Because the way you acted back there, the way you lost yourself, I've never seen that from you. Not once, in all the years you've been here. You were reckless. You were emotional. You were human, Midoriya. That's not the surgeon I've come to know. So if I'm going to understand how to move forward with you on this case, I need a clearer picture. Izuku's hands curled in his lap, nails digging into his palms. A clearer picture. If only he had one himself. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because yes, Katsuki was close, too close, but in ways he couldn't even put into words. A lifetime of contradictions, of longing and grief, all coiled into one name he couldn't say aloud. And it wasn't just the chief who didn't know. Nobody knew. Not his mother, who still asked gently about Katsuki sometimes, wondering why her son always shut down at the mention of his name. Not his friends, who probably assumed his silence was just professional courtesy. No one knew that Izuku Midoriya had spent his entire life tying himself in knots over Katsuki Bakugou. No one knew that the boy who once hurt him was the same boy who lived, in some twisted way, under his skin. So he sat there, silent, while the chief studied him. And the silence spoke volumes. The chief's sigh lingered in the room. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I'm not going to press you any further, Midoriya. I think I have the picture now." Izuku's chest tightened, heat pricking the back of his neck. He didn't dare ask what picture the chief thought he had, didn't dare confirm or deny it. "But before we move forward, I need to tell you one thing," the chief continued, his voice softer now. "It is okay to break down over someone you know. It is okay to be human. I know surgeons tend to carry this idea that we have to be stone-cold, detached, machines in scrubs, but that isn't true. Not always." Izuku stared at the floor, at the faint scuffs on the tile. His throat felt raw. It was okay to be human. He didn't feel human. He felt like a mess of contradictions, like a child who never grew out of flinching at a single name. He felt inadequate. And yet something in the chief's words slid under his skin. Maybe the very thing unraveling him was also what had driven him to fight to keep Katsuki here. Maybe being human was what saved him. Maybe being human was what nearly ruined him too. "That said, you broke protocol," the chief said firmly. "You overstepped a colleague's authority in front of his team. You disregarded the chain of command. That's unacceptable here, Midoriya. You know that." Izuku nodded, accepting the reprimand. "The only reason I'm not making this something bigger," the chief continued, "is because at the end of the day, you did your job. You saved a patient's life. And while Saito will no doubt take this as an insult, I'll make it clear to him, our first duty is always to the person on that table. You spared a family grief tonight. You did him a favor, even if neither of you can admit that right now." Izuku swallowed hard, his throat aching. He wanted to believe that, but all he could think about was the way his voice had broken when speaking to Katsuki, the silence that had stretched when he felt paralyzed, and how Mitsuki and Masaru would never forgive him if that silence had lasted a moment longer. The chief leaned back in his chair, studying Izuku in silence for a moment before speaking again. "I'm going to ask you this once, Midoriya." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. "Do you want to be in charge of this case? Do you want this responsibility back?" Izuku froze. His mouth opened, then shut again, unsure. Did he want it? He didn't know. Every time he stepped away, something in him screamed to come back. Every time he stepped closer, he felt like he was doing more harm than good. The truth was, he didn't know if he was capable of being what Katsuki needed. The chief's gaze sharpened. "Because you do understand that if you are not in charge of a patient, you cannot overstep the assigned physician. You understand that?" Izuku swallowed hard, his throat dry. He nodded, a stiff gesture, because words failed him. "Then Dr. Saito will remain in charge until further notice," the chief said, his tone steady and final. "You can help him, but you will not override him. You will not step in uninvited. The only time I'll allow you near that case is if Saito himself calls you, or if circumstances demand it, like today. Do you understand?" Izuku's stomach twisted. Relief and dread tangled in his chest until he couldn't tell them apart. He managed a low, "Yes, sir," though it felt like it scraped its way out of him. The chief let out a breath through his nose, the faintest sign of weariness, before his voice dropped again. "I don't ever want to see what I saw today repeated, Midoriya. Not the shouting, not the insubordination. You are better than that. You've proven it time and time again." But, he paused, something gentler edging into his tone. I also know why you did it. And I'll say it again, it is not weakness to care. But caring doesn't excuse recklessness. Find your balance. Izuku's chest squeezed tight. Find your balance. As if balance had ever existed for him when it came to Katsuki. The chief gave a small nod. That will be all. You're dismissed, Dr. Midoriya. Izuku nodded. He pushed himself to his feet, the legs that had frozen on him earlier somehow carrying him now, each step toward the door heavier than the last. The handle was cool under his palm. He pulled the door open. The silence of the hallway pressed in at once, heavier than the chief's words had been, heavier than the reprimand still ringing in his ears. His chest ached, guilt gnawing sharp and restless. Balance. The word felt like a cruel joke. How could he ever find balance when Katsuki tilted the whole axis of his life just by existing? He kept his head down, forcing his feet forward, until he nearly collided with the figure waiting just outside. Dr. Saito. The man didn't speak. He didn't have to. The sneer twisting his face said more than words could, sharp with disdain. Izuku had seen sneers before, and for some reason, this one didn't scare him at all. Not like Katsuki's had. Katsuki's had always cut deeper, because they meant something. Because he meant something. Izuku didn't know if it was because Katsuki had planted that fear so deep it never left, or because Dr. Saito simply wasn't worth fearing. Maybe it was both. All he knew was that this man's opinion didn't touch him the way Katsuki's always had. And with that quiet, miserable thought, Izuku walked off down the hall. Izuku leaned against the counter, flipping through the last of the forms with a tired hand. Most of the discharge instructions had been given already. Across from him, Dabi sat slouched in the chair, bandaged arms crossed, blue eyes half-lidded in that way that always made him look like he was laughing at something only he knew. That's it, Izuku said finally, sliding the chart closed. You're clear to go. Dabi didn't move, didn't thank him, just tilted his head and let a crooked grin curl across his face. And the bill? Don't think I missed the part where you keep covering it. You know I don't have much. When I get the cash, I'll pay you back. Izuku shook his head, exhaustion tugging the corners of his mouth into something that wasn't quite a smile. You can pay me back by taking care of yourself. For a beat, Dabi just stared at him, that grin fading into something sharper. Then he huffed a short, humorless laugh. That's a bad deal, Doc. You know I don't do favors I can't keep. Izuku didn't answer right away. His hands tightened on the chart. When he didn't respond, Dabi's gaze narrowed, keen in a way that made Izuku's skin prickle. Something's off. You look exhausted. Did one of your heroes have a rough day? He had no idea, Izuku thought, throat tightening. Not yet. But close enough. Too close. Katsuki had faced so many challenges today he'd lost count twice in the OR, again in the ICU. Each time Izuku had fought to bring him back. Izuku forced himself to close the chart, slipped the pen back into his pocket. It's just been a really long day. Yeah, I can tell. Dabi's mouth crooked into something between a smirk and a sneer. Your scrubs are a weird shade. Izuku froze, looking down at himself before he could stop. He hadn't changed. Not once since the OR. Not after the ICU. His whole body was stained, the deep maroon of dried BLDSTRKNG across his chest and sleeves. He was amazed no one had said anything. Amazed that the chief hadn't ordered him straight to the locker room, Dabi's eyes flicked upward, catching the way Izuku's hand twitched toward his face. You've got some on your cheek, too, he pointed out. Izuku swallowed hard, realizing he hadn't even noticed. It had been there since the first surgery. He felt like a madman. Maybe that's why no one had stopped him, because they could see it unraveling across his face. Complicated surgery, Izuku finally said, the closest to an answer he could give without breaking apart. Dabi's laugh was raspy. Complicated. Is that what you call it? He leaned back, eyes glinting. Looks to me like you drowned in somebody else's mess and forgot how to climb out. Tell me, Doc, does the BLD get lighter the more of it you wear, or do you just stop seeing it? Is this what you signed up for? Tell me this isn't what happens when you build your whole life around saving people who were born to bleed out sooner or later. Izuku's stomach lurched, and he didn't answer. The words burned their way into him, lodging somewhere deep, where they hurt too much to dislodge. He stood there in silence, unraveling thread by thread, the weight of BLD in his scrubs suddenly heavier than it had been a moment ago. You don't know what you're talking about, he managed to say. The pushback felt weak. Dobby's eyes lit up like a match had been struck. The silence stretched until Dobby broke it with a rough scoff. He leaned back on the cot, eyes cutting sideways with something almost like concession. Don't get too bent out of shape, document. If I knew you were this shaken, I wouldn't have said anything. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, shaking his head faintly. Sorry. It's just been a long day. Yeah, you said that, Dobby muttered, flicking his gaze over Izuku's scrubs again. Then he smirked, sharp and tired all at once. You look rough, but you still keep showing up. Guess I should be grateful. Izuku ignored the jab. I'll book your next appointment, he said firmly, slipping back into that professional cadence because it was the only thing that kept him from unraveling. I know you're not going to. Dobby's grin curled at that, almost satisfied. You know me so well, document. I'll let you know the time, Izuku pressed on, already scribbling the note for himself. And your prescription's filed. Same pharmacy as last time. Just, pick it up, please. Dobby raised a brow. What, no house call DLVRY? Thought you were footing the bill. I'll keep covering it, he said simply. But you need to take it. Every dose. No excuses. He hesitated, then forced his eyes up to meet Dobby's, green locking against blue. And stop using your quirk. It's destroying you. Every time you push it, you're making my job harder and one day, I might not be able to keep up. For a moment, something flickered across Dobby's expression, gone as quickly as it came. Doc, if I cared about keeping myself alive, I wouldn't be me. But since you're the only one willing to keep patching me up, he let the words trail off, then shrugged. Fine. I'll pick up the meds. Izuku exhaled, tension bleeding out of his shoulders. Good. That's all I ask. Dobby swung his legs over the edge of the cot, testing the strength in them before pushing himself up. He moved like every bone ached but forced it into swagger, one hand shoved into his pocket. Well, Doc, he said, voice drawling with mock gratitude, thanks for letting me go. Izuku tried not to sound exasperated. I wouldn't exactly say letting you. I'd feel a lot better if someone was here to pick you up. But since I know you don't roll that way, he trailed off, giving a tired shrug. Just, take it easy, all right. Dobby's grin curved sideways, a flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. Relax, document. You patch me up, I tear myself apart again, and we rinse, repeat. It's practically our routine by now. He tipped his head, tone dry. What would you even do without me? Before Izuku could muster a response, something caught between scolding and exhausted disbelief. Dobby was already slipping past him, out into the hallway. The door swung shut in his wake, leaving only the faint scent of burnt ash clinging to the room. Izuku sat there for a moment, chart still in his hand, staring at the empty cot. He scrubbed a hand down his face. On any other day, Izuku would have brushed Dobby's words off. He knew better by now. The man threw out backhanded comments like sparks off a flame, half for the sting, half for the show. But today his head was already too crowded. What would you even do without me? It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. It tangled with another voice, one that burned hotter, sharper. What would I do without Kaken? The two collided, echoed, overlapped, until it was just noise in his skull. He pressed the heel of his palm against his temple, willing it to stop. He needed to get his thoughts together. Izuku made his way towards the nurse assigned to Dabi's file, gave the last of the discharge instructions, and made sure the prescription was logged. It was routine by now, he'd cover the cost, Dabi would grumble but still pick it up. The strange little rhythm they'd fallen into. Izuku told himself not to dwell. Because his next stop was Todoroki. He glanced at the clock on the wall as he walked, feet dragging heavier than usual. His shift ended at 6, and Todoroki was his last patient of the day. After that, he could technically go home. The idea should have felt like relief, but instead it made his chest tighten. Home meant being alone with everything clawing inside his head. And right now, the thought of that was terrifying. He shoved the thought down as he pulled up Todoroki's file on the tablet. Labs weren't back yet, that would take a few more hours at least, though he'd expedited them. Imaging, though, was ready. Chest, abdomen, the scans he'd ordered to check the organ strain. He flipped through them with his thumb as he walked. Things he already suspected, laid out in grayscale. By the time he reached Todoroki's room, he'd schooled his face back into something calm, even if his insides were screaming. Izuku paused at the door longer than he meant to. His hand hovered on the handle, knuckles white where he gripped the chart. This was Todoroki Shoto. The number 2 hero. On any other day, he would have been buzzing with nerves, maybe even let himself slip into fanboy mode the way he had with Mirio. On any other day, Izuku might have felt a sense of pride working with someone of Todoroki's caliber, but today was different. He was still in scrubs, stained from a long and exhausting day. The weight of the events that had unfolded pressed heavily on him, making it difficult to even stand outside the hospital room. He pushed through the door to find Todoroki sitting upright in the hospital bed, looking sharp despite the bruising on his jaw. "You don't look good," Todoroki remarked, his tone flat and devoid of hesitation. Izuku blinked, taken aback. That wasn't the greeting he had anticipated. For a moment, he felt as if he was hearing Dabi's voice echoing in his mind, reflecting his own exhaustion. It was strange how two men, so different and from opposite ends of the world, could express the same sentiment. Izuku tried to compose himself, smoothing out his expression before responding. "Yeah, I've had a long day." He opened the chart, attempting to refocus, but Todoroki's slight head tilt caught him off guard. "Do you need a moment?" Izuku was surprised, blinking at him as if he had spoken a different language. "No, I'm fine." "Are you sure? You don't just look unwell, your appearance suggests it too." Todoroki's gaze flicked down, clearly noting the state of Izuku's scrubs. Izuku felt heat rise to the back of his neck at the reminder of his appearance. "I'm fine," he insisted, more firmly this time. "Let's focus on you, shall we?" Todoroki nodded, not arguing further. Izuku skimmed the chart. "Have you been using your quirk these past few days?" Todoroki's eyes flickered, and his shoulders stiffened slightly. His silence spoke volumes. Izuku continued, "You were at that fight, weren't you? The one that left half the city in ruins." Todoroki nodded sharply. "And I'm guessing," Izuku hesitated before pressing on. "You only used your ice." Todoroki's jaw twitched, and he looked away, as if searching for the answer on the sterile wall. After a long pause, he finally replied, "Yes." "And it happened again." Izuku nodded, offering no judgment. He flipped to the imaging printouts, tracing the notes he had made the night before. "I did a lot of research and came up with some options for you." Todoroki's surprise was evident as he turned to face Izuku. "You, what? After everything you said last time?" "I still want you to use your quirk," Izuku interjected, meeting Todoroki's gaze. "It's yours, not anyone else's. If you want to move forward, you'll need to use all of it, not just half." Todoroki remained silent, his expression unreadable, but the stillness was enough of an answer. Izuku exhaled sharply. If you don't want to use it, that's fine. Since I know using your fire is delicate for you, I've come up with a few options for now. He flipped through the pages in the folder, his tone sharper than usual. Until you realize you need to use your own quirk, which means all of it. His words landed heavily, and while Todoroki didn't flinch, his stillness spoke volumes. Izuku felt a twinge of regret. Was he being too harsh? But he pressed on, unable to soften the truth. Option 1, medication. I can prescribe something to help manage the migraines and muscle fatigue. It'll buy you time but won't stop the deterioration. He pointed to a dark spot on one of the scans. These are stress fractures in your sternum. They're minor now, but they're already happening. It's not just headaches, Todoroki, it's your heart, your lungs. If you keep fighting like this, it'll catch up to you. He turned to another film, showing inflammation across the lungs. Option 2, you start training your fire side in controlled doses. Small amounts in safe environments to build tolerance. It won't erase the damage already done, but it'll prevent new damage from piling on. Izuku's chest felt heavy as he spoke. Those are your choices. You can take the meds and buy time until there's none left, or you can use your quirk, all of it, and keep the damage from catching up to you. He watched Todoroki closely, waiting for a response, but all he received was silence. And just to be clear, he added, meeting Todoroki's gaze with a wry edge, this isn't influenced by your father. I don't care if Endeavor himself offers me money. This is just me, as your doctor, telling you the truth. The first option is there because I know you might take it. You're so focused on freezing yourself out that you can't see anything else. The second option. That's me saying you'll harm yourself if you keep going like this. Izuku's thoughts drifted to other patients, each struggling in their own way. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their battles, knowing that heroes often push themselves to their limits. And here was another one, sitting right in front of him, determined to follow the same path. He almost laughed, bitter and hollow. What was it with his patients? Was he drawing them in because he was just as troubled, maybe worse? He was falling apart too. He hated himself for it, and he didn't care. You're not invincible, Izuku said, his voice quieter now. You don't have to act like you are. Todoroki sat in silence, his eyes dropping to the scans, tracing the pale streaks across the lungs, the stress lines like cracks in ice spiderwebbing across bone. He stayed there a long time, so long that Izuku wondered if he'd even answer at all. Then, finally, Todoroki spoke. You sound like you know what that feels like. Izuku's chest tightened. For a moment, he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't sure what showed on his face, but whatever it was, Todoroki noticed. Izuku swallowed. I know what it looks like, he said carefully, shutting the folder with a dull thud. I see it every day. Todoroki hummed, non-committal, but his eyes lingered, searching in a way that made Izuku's skin prickle. Like he knew Izuku hadn't told him everything. Like maybe he wouldn't press now, but he wasn't going to forget, either. I'll think about it, Todoroki said at last, his voice low but sure. Izuku nodded, a tiny, grateful nod. Okay. That's fair. Do you want me to give you the details now, or after you've decided which way you're leaning? I'd like to hear both, Todoroki replied without hesitation. Izuku nodded once, tugging the folder open again. All right. First option, it's strictly medical. He flipped through the papers, pulling out a sheet. A medication regimen designed to slow the progression of what we're seeing in your scans. It'll take the edge off the migraines, help regulate the strain you're putting on your system. But, his eyes flicked up, serious. It comes with restrictions. No alcohol, no smoking, you'll have to adjust your diet to avoid any interactions. And your training you'd have to cut back significantly. Maybe not stop completely, but tone it down a lot. He slid the sheet across the desk toward Todoroki, who glanced down at the neat rows of pills and dosages without a word. Second option, Izuku hesitated. Second option is less about medicine, more about strategy. That got Todoroki's attention. His heterochromatic eyes lifted. Izuku felt heat crawl up the back of his neck, but he pushed on, unable to stop himself. You'd start slow. Controlled exposure to your fire, little by little, while balancing with your ice. Training 4.